To start things off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Larry Borok, and how I got into this position I'll never know. But anyway, this evening should be a very interesting evening. It's not going to be a simple bull session. I think it'll be a session where people will actually start to develop a real urban problem-solving oriented architectural curriculum. We'll be breaking down into groups a little later, and at that time we'll see exactly what we... As kind of a way of prefacing this evening, I'd like to introduce Mr. Hornbostel, who is head of the National Institute for Architectural Education, who has kind of put the whole thing together itself.
I'm not even going to get up. We started off about a year ago in New York City, the NIAE as we call it, trying to find how and in what direction we could do something to bring about, I would call confrontation is a good word for it, between the establishment, between the students, and between the radicals and the conservatives within the profession. And because of the turmoil that was going on in New York, we decided to set up a series of what we called at that time think tanks, in which we had a very small group similar to this, in which we had 4 speakers, and we drew in students, young practicing architects, sociologists, urban planners, bankers, people from the Ford Foundation, and held these meetings similar to this to see what would come out of it and what we would find and whether we could find anything that perhaps would help the whole problem of what the whole architectural profession and, say, the whole education profession is going through. So we've held these, we've had 6 of them, and we decided we would go across the country if possible. And this is the first one we're holding, or sponsoring, let us say, out of the city. We hope to have one in Chicago, one in Houston, one in Washington, D.C., and maybe one in the South. And when we're through with this, that is why we have mics here and the tape. These will be taped, and we hope to take all this information, whatever comes out of it, whatever it may be, edit it somehow, put it together in some form, and then distribute it to all parties who want it. So that's how I happen to be here. I want to see this thing run, and I'm to take back this information. And from what I see tonight, I think it's going to be a very, very good meeting, and I think the way to look at it is put all the bars down and let fly and talk any way you want to. Okay.
At this point, a brief kind of description of what will be happening or might not be happening, as the case may be. What the 4 panelists are going to do this evening is essentially outline a problem that hopefully we might think of some at least preliminary solutions for. They're going to go and outline the problem of the urban crisis, the urban world, see exactly how architecture as a profession and architectural education as a means towards educating people can possibly relate to the so-called urban crisis and possibly come up with some real solutions to it. And to lead things off, I'd like to introduce Pinky Briggs, who's Program Director for the Compton Willowbrook Enterprise Action Community Agency, a rather long-winded title. And Pinky will start off the wrap on essentially what the people, the grassroots level, see as their very, very real needs, and these needs with relation to the architectural profession.
Well, look like I done hit the jackpot after all these years. You know, like I done got to the people that I really wanted to get to. Because I've always felt that change in the environment, which I've been experimenting with for the past year, has some good sociological aspects to it. So if I do it with 20 guys by taking them out of the ghetto and taking them up into the mountains and breaking them of dropping pills and give them some meaningful outdoor work and put them into school, that their thoughts about the world isn't so rough, and like they're a little bit easier to conform to the standards that we must live by. So perhaps if we would change the environment, it might help. I'm sure it couldn't do any harm, because if they don't do anything about it, they'll probably burn them down. They're not theirs. Attitudes. What part can architecture play in changing the attitudes of the people in the slums? Exciting designs, perhaps, low-cost housing. This is the dream, that all of the people in the ghetto usually have. They eventually, one time before they die, they want a house. Most of them never achieve it. So, I think that if we reach this point, where that you can bring all of these learned minds together and their expertise, perhaps we can play a great part in changing the face of America. I would hope so. I think it can be done, and I know nothing about architecture. I just know what I like. So now that I'm here, I'm going to see what the brains come up with. I've seen quite a few people go out in the ghetto and they get some terrific ideas. But I wonder, when is the time going to come? So maybe this is it. Starting here. I deal with people, and all of the people that I deal with, I try to know them on a personal level so that I can understand them, their dreams, their desires, their hopes, and those that are without hope. How much untapped resources there are in the ghetto that perhaps that architecture could play a part in developing. These are the questions that I would like to have answered. And is there any hope, really? So, do we use all of the exciting new materials that technology has developed and be able to house people where that they can have green grass and trees and things like that, and no streets? Or will we just build little cracker boxes and little straight up buildings and pack them all in there? I think that architecture could do something about it. Don't you? I would just like to see it happen, or attempt it anyway. The question is, can it be done? Do we have the resources to do it? I think now is the time that these questions should be answered. We are the leaders of the world. Well, I'm here because I believe that it'll happen. And I think that basically all of us must be thinking something in that realm, or else we wouldn't be here. So I'm all ears. I want to go back and be able to tell people that, hang on, it's coming.
Okay. I figure it in terms of handling this kind of little sidelight. After all four speakers are finished, we'll take questions for about 10 or 15 minutes and then break down into the group. So if anyone needs any pads or pencils, they're right there at this point to write down any ideas. Okay. Next speaker is Professor Thomas Freeland, head of UCLA's new architecture program. And in speaking with Professor Vreeland before this evening, I learned that that the school is presently developing the new Third World College at the UC campus at San Diego, and I think that this is kind of a brand new approach that in terms of building buildings, or in this case building a fairly large complex like a college is concerned with, to first of all have an architecture school actually design a building as opposed to some firm, and second of all have the architects work directly with, in this case, the students, but in general the people, is a real change, kind of a thing that kind of puts into practice what Pinky kind of laid out. And at this point, like Professor Vreeland to kind of go into that.
Okay, Larry, thanks. We have a number of architects here this evening, and so I have a feeling I'd better go into that. Actually, we will be involved with a third college, but not quite in the way that you describe it. But let me back up. Firstly, I'd like to make my remarks this evening somewhat in response to Mr. Briggs' questions and somewhat challenges, to which I feel highly responsive. I think in listening to what he had to say, I began to see really what I should be saying here this evening, which wasn't very clear when I first came. And I'd like to put it this way, that there are fundamental changes taking place right now in architectural education. Everyone involved in it senses it. And if one were to try to sum up in some simple way what these changes were about, why they were made necessary, there are so many reasons, it's confused. But I think that one way that I at least explain it to myself is that historically the architect was responding to the needs of people who were very much like himself. And historically, I think all architects are very concerned with history, probably more than other professions. I doubt very much if engineers spend very much time studying the history of engineering. If they do, it's a side interest, really. Engineering is pragmatic, it's concerned with right now, and so forth. Architecture goes very far back, and I think it stretches back in the imagination and the minds of architects themselves. They're very aware of the history of architecture when they work. Traditionally, architects served popes and princes, or privileged classes, or ruling classes, or what you will. And the architect himself was trained very much within that elite group. And up until quite recently, architecture education was relatively simple from at least the social point of view. There was a common understanding between the architect and the people whom he served. They came from roughly the same class with the same background, and there were many things that simply didn't need to be spoken, and one could get right down to the business of solving the immediate problem. But today, this is far from true. The client has expanded to where really it is, or certainly should be, the whole population. It's people at every level of our society. And the differences are enormous, so enormous that no man in the course of educating himself as an architect can possibly understand the needs of all of the groups at every level of our society that he must serve. This has left the architects with traditional education somewhat disarmed. and I think we've all had the experience of discovering that there is a gap of understanding between us and some group whom we supposedly have been hired to help. And I won't extend this by giving instances of it. I can think of one very tragic case of a man I worked for in Philadelphia who grew up in the slums of Philadelphia, literally in complete poverty. He was Russian. His parents were Russian immigrants, and he rose to be probably one of the greatest architects in America today. And as a result, or in the course of his practice, was asked to work on a housing project in Philadelphia, and I am sure that he was convinced that what he was doing was in complete response for the particular group he was working for, and found to his dismay in the course of a really unpleasant meeting in which he was called many names, that he had missed by a tremendously long shot serving them, and he I think to this day probably hasn't recovered from this. I use this as an illustration of the fact that in most cases the architect's failure to meet social needs is not from maliciousness or from bad intentions, but I simply think that it's not been part of our training to develop the techniques, the methodologies, the weapons, etc., that do exist today, are used in other disciplines and in other professions. We simply don't learn these at school, that are needed in order to really understand the problem in, we'll say, in the detached, coldly scientific way that a doctor has to face diseases and so forth. And I think this is probably what is needed. I think probably without question that all the heart in the world, and this man certainly had heart, is not going to close this gap. We're all going to need a kind of, we architects are going to need a kind of education that's never been part of traditional architectural education. Where do the tools come from? Where do the methods come from? Certainly many of them come from the social sciences, where they've been developed to a high degree. All right, to shorten this, we are attempting in our school, a school which combines planning, architecture, and urban design, to train our students in these methods. As a result, we have what I would call quite an unorthodox faculty. Who come, many of them who come with backgrounds in the social sciences, in psychology, in fields quite outside of architecture. Now, we feel that an important part of training, and this is graduate level training for architects, is field work. That today no one knows enough to teach purely in the classroom. That our students will learn not only in the classroom, but they will learn from being active in the field, from working with professionals in a form of internship during their training, and watching and with their faculty. The project, as an illustration of this, we hope to be working. Excuse me. All right, getting to the problem of the third college. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the third college in San Diego. It has proposed an academic program which is being reviewed right now and probably will be approved in some form by the regents. Really, the crux of the proposal is that 70% of the students in the college either be from the black community or the Chicano community. It's oriented chiefly toward these two minorities. The academic program is therefore quite unique and different from what the other two colleges are at San Diego. To make it brief, it's a very different problem than is usually faced in the development of educational facilities on the at the University of California campuses. We've been asked to join with the third college academic planners as consultants to some aspects of the physical planning. We are operating with foundation grant money, and we have not been hired as architects for the third college. The actual architect for the third college will be selected following the normal procedures the University of California uses, and they will of course be paid through the funds which are allotted for this. We were simply called in because within because the situation was judged by the third college people to be extraordinary. They felt that the additional study which we could bring to their problem would help them and also help the architects who will eventually design the third college in solving a difficult and unusual problem. We hope to use this project to test and put into effect some of these new techniques and methods that we're teaching in the school. It's an opportunity to work very closely in participation with the black and brown students and faculty from the third college to use various techniques of finding out from them what their actual needs are. I think that the key word in all of this is participation on the part of the client. What we're hoping to do is to bring him in as closely as possible to work with us during this programming and planning phase of the third college. We will learn a great deal from them, and I believe that they will learn quite a bit from us. They're curious about the architectural process, and they look forward very much to jointly, in a sense, planning their future education facilities. I think that pretty well sums it up, Larry.
Taking it from there, we're getting into kind of a more academic seeing how a school per se is getting into the development of a new academic environment for a specific group of people. I'd like to now introduce John Mutlow, who is an architect affiliated with the Pico Union project, which is a project specifically designed for a community in Los Angeles, who will talk in terms of a number of other things happening there with housing, for example.
I'm not really sure as to my title in the handout, but I've basically considered myself up to very recently as an advocacy planner. And it's only as the community's interests have changed that I've recently turned over to housing as my major concern. Every time I see Tim, it brings me back to the days when I was in the architectural school here at UCLA, which was only last year. And whilst I was there, before the new curriculum was in fact developed, a group of students, including myself, felt that the program was missing something, and that something was missing was real world. we felt so strongly about this that during the summer we wrote a 50-page proposal, which basically was our own program for our last year of graduate study, which was in fact accepted by the school. Tonight I'd like to discuss an action proposal, just one action proposal, which I think might answer some of the problems in relationship to some of the needs, A, of the communities, and B, where the architectural schools can provide. Now this is predicated on a series of assumptions. One is that the university is willing to be involved in the urban crisis. Now we've all know, I think, of President Hitch's speech last year where he said that this was so. In fact, not only so, urban crisis money was allocated to the UC system. So it is basically a University of California policy as I understand it. I'm not so sure about USC, I'm not quite so familiar. But according to Leonard Wines, who's the executive director of the university relations, now I'm quoting from the UCLA Bruins' only serious competitor, and that's the USC Trojan, that, quote, people who think that USC should do more for the community basically misunderstand the role and function of a university. Wines said that the primary functions of a university are to teach and to research. He added that the university can best serve the community by carrying out its primary functions, but assistance can be given if it is at a level where we are uniquely able to do it. So you must see that USC and UCLA don't quite have the same goals. According to many students I've spoken to at USC, they are in fact out in the urban sphere, especially in the Normandy 5 project, which is right on their back doorstep. Another assumption is that basically I don't think the university's prime motive can be for money when it's directly related to the urban crisis, such as an architectural office obviously is. Funds from any source are very limited in urban crisis programs. I think what we seriously should be looking at is the students receiving academic credit for their involvement, academic credit and experience. Now, what situations are there in which both the university and the minority or low-income communities can benefit? Well, I think you must assume there must be a direct tie between, let's assume there is a direct tie between low income and the urban crisis, which I believe there is. Number one, obviously, is setting up a design clinic. Well, this has been well published, and also there was one set up in LA a couple of years back in the Hoover project, which I understand didn't go down too well. Another possibility is that the university could work with the city or like organizations such as CRA. But here I think the student doesn't have the responsibility he basically requires. I kind of feel that the student is more of a cog in a machine. And city organizations such as this are not so hard-pressed to have budget to employ people to handle the priority problems that they face. So experience is probably the major factor there. Right at the other end of the scale, and I think this is where it's at, is that students can work for community organizations, such as a community non-profit corporation. And this is what I would like to explore tonight. Because basically I believe this is where most benefit will accrue to both parties. What is a community's real needs? Well, I'm not an expert, but during the time I've been involved in communities, I have been able to identify two spheres. One is the housing conditions, and the second is whether there are adequate recreational facilities for all ages in the community. I'd like to just tackle one tonight, housing, and try and come up with a definite proposal. Housing conditions in most minority areas are in fact extremely poor. In fact, if not critical. There is a housing crisis throughout America at the present time. So, what can we do to provide expertise to community organizations to develop their own housing proposals or programs? Well, the problem is that community organizations lack funds, specifically front money for the hiring of expertise to do their housing programs for them. Are there many community organizations that are seriously interested in developing housing programs, proposals, whatever? Well, I've met a number who in fact are, and just don't have the sources to be able to hire anyone to do anything about it. How could we select community organizations? Well, I think they have to be well organized, enthusiastic, and possibly within renewal or NDP areas, even model cities, although I hear model cities in LA is floundering at the present time. Why in such areas? Well, basically because CRA can resell land to non-profit organizations at a less than cost. This can increase the quality of the housing, and also CRA supporting a non-profit organization can increase the community's ability to build and will help support the application of the non-profit to FHA. Now, FHA at the present time, the last time I spoke to Gordon Hunt, had a waiting list of 116,000 applications. Where does yours fit amongst 116,000? Well, if you have CRA support from an area that is already federally subsidized, you basically receive very high priority. What type of housing? Well, definitely not public. I haven't been able to find a single person who is in fact for public housing. There's a kind of stigma. Also, most people don't like to live in skyscrapers. So I think we have to revert to the lower moderate income housing proposals such as FHA 235 and 236. One's a rental program and the other is a home ownership. And the home ownership aspect is extremely unique, and this is basically what poor people have been crying for ages, home ownership. It just has been outside their basic financial capability. Where's the money coming from for this housing proposal? Well, FHA will finance a non-profit up to 100% of the project cost. So there's your money if you have the expertise. What kind of housing proposals are community people basically interested in, and at what kind of densities? They definitely don't like high densities. And at the moment, at least in our neighborhood, they seem to be favoring the townhouse concept, the terraced townhouse home ownership concept. How do students benefit, on the other hand? Well, apart from the obvious social benefits, they learn something about community politics. What is your councilman, your assemblyman? How does he fit into the community? Come to understand the City Planning Commission as members, Planning Committee of City Council, and City Council itself. Begin to learn where their heads are really at and how the back door to politics begins to work. They also learn about packaging housing. FHA is an extremely complicated process, which takes at least 12 months if you're lucky. And then you're never sure they're going to fund it at the end of that. There are a number of unique FHA regulations which you have to comply with besides city regulations, and they're extremely stiff. The student has to learn financial mechanisms. This is one thing I found extremely lacking in my urban design education at school. What money was all about. What is front money? What is equity? What does cash flow mean? What does the percentage interest on a loan really mean? Where can there be savings in a project? And how does ethnicity really affect design planning? And then, of course, the student gets into actual design. This is really what he's crying for. At least when I was at school, that's what we were crying for. You get into the actual construction of a project, understand materials, new materials, understand prefabrication techniques, how can they apply to low-income housing and the problem that there is. Looking at prefabrication techniques for timber housing, steel, aluminium, concrete, whatever. You can test the market to find out what the residents really want. Do the residents really understand housing themselves? We basically found out the answer is no. and we've had to take many of the community residents around existing low-income housing proposals so they can really understand what low-income housing is. And when they understood this, they then voted a very big yes for it. There's a great difference between low-income housing and public housing. They can also learn factory techniques. A lot of students are into prefabrication techniques, into system building, mobile home techniques, on-site construction. So there's a whole new realm possibly opened up to the student there. A couple of last points, I think. As you see, as I went through the list of the experience a student can obtain, this basically must be a joint effort. It's not just architectural students. It must be interdisciplinary. Architecture, planning, urban design, even economists. And this is again something that's extremely new to the university. Students working on, from different segments, different departments, working on the same problem. Also, I don't think the university should duplicate architectural offices and the services they provide. That's why I say they must go to a non-profit which can afford the expertise. If successful, the university then can collect if successful, and I guarantee that they all won't be, the university could then pick up the architectural fees, and this could give monetary support, or RAs, to the students. Or, if this wasn't feasible to start off, the university might apply for a federal program. In closing, I'd just like to say, I think we could fill a gap here that no one else has filled to date. Thank you.
At this point, I kind of have a few comments to make. Each speaker so far has kind of outlined general problem. General problem is relationship between the architectural profession and different segments of it, and the urban world and different facets of that, as have been presented, as I said. Now, to kind of get this down to brass tacks at the moment, how does this all relate to architectural education, specifically based upon the information so far and the information that you have and the experiences that you have? What type of an architect would you like turned out after 3 years or 4 years or 5 years in some architectural school at some college or university in this country? Well, in thinking about that, you have to first get into, well, what makes up that student exactly. What does he have going for him? What does he have going against him? What can he do on his own? And to that end, I personally have kind of been involved in the development of at least to a manner of speaking, an undergraduate architectural curriculum, a pre-professional as opposed to a professional one, and thought that kind of discussing this might get a few things rolling. I think that first of all, say you have a student who comes to UCLA as a freshman. He has 4 years here. How will he spend them? I would think it best to first of all spend the first 2 outside of the university as much as possible. He's been sitting inside a classroom for 12 years. It might be an idea to give him a break from that same environment for a while. At the same time, I found that you can probably learn more political science, more sociology, more psychology if you have some basic interests in that field, in the streets, shall we say, as opposed to sitting in a classroom and learning about ethnic and status groups. You can learn about them the way from a much different perspective. At the same time, it hits you personally as opposed to very, very abstractly, very intellectually. To that end, you can get involved in different housing projects, as John has mentioned. Maybe not designing housing projects, but working with other people, helping them in their daily needs, working with social workers, for example, and analyzing that whole paternalistic system and how it functions and how it, in fact, is counterproductive to the needs of people on welfare, as many people here know. Thirdly, you can find out about groups such as the Black Panthers, such as the Brown Berets, and then go to the other side of the coin and, say, attend city council hearings. That's definitely the other side of the coin. Based upon these backgrounds, working with people, say, as Mrs. Margaret Wright, who is working on decentralization of the school system, or working with people such as Católicos por la Raza, for example, who are working involving the church. Things such as this, you can get a real feel for exactly what you then are going to try and prepare yourself to work for, prepare yourself to go and design a new urban world. Then, from the academic standpoint, you can go. In this case, I've developed a few things in terms of not turning out specifically a draftsman, and for that matter, not turning out a sociologist either. I think both really do not get at the problem. I think what you have to do is turn out, after 4 years of undergraduate education, a person who is well versed in problem solving, a person who can approach most problems, or most any problem, from a certain structural and analytical standpoint, who can approach it from an innovative standpoint, from the standpoint of, well, he's not going to solve the problem by reading what other people have done for the past 1,000 years. He might use all of that, but it might be a better idea to try and figure out how he can maybe design his own answer for it and experiment with it. The key thing, I think, as John has mentioned and others here have mentioned, is kind of a feeling of experimentation, of getting in and trying something. Trying something is, in this case, I think, is better than nothing. To that angle, as kind of a sample curriculum, say for the person's third year in college, after his first two, of essentially having an experiential thing outside of the university, as well as taking a number of basic courses that will give him some sort of concrete foundation to work from. I think the best place to start out with would be history, and say take it for the urban world and urban problem solving, to try and analyze how certain historical societies had been designed. Take it from the standpoint of seeing precisely how ancient cultures, ancient societies try to go and deal with the problems of decentralization of school systems, or democracy, or of going and having a police force that enforces the law and not a value system instead, for example. And simultaneous with this history, taking history from a problem-solving standpoint, I think taking design, not design in the architectural sense, but design in the art sense. Taking design, for example, UCLA's design division of its art school, because in design you're approaching problems again. You're given the problem, in essence, of transferring what's inside your head, an idea, into something tangible, something you can see. And if you succeed in actually doing that, you have created a so-called work of art. If not, well, it's the way it goes. But in essence, really experimenting and either succeeding or failing, but actually doing something. This is the big shift in emphasis now, not going and having a professor tell you how you're supposed to go and design a building, but instead experiment with designing buildings. I think this is a key point. Then, for your fourth year, you would get into some things involving social psychology. I think that would be very, very valuable, especially after a background of two years in the urban world. Then analyzing it from the social psychology standpoint would be very, very valuable in terms of attitude formation, group behavior, things such as that. Also have more things now going specifically into the architectural profession itself. In this case, taking courses, for example, in urban theory, in environmental design, in basic structural design, things along this line. Also, there's a specific program I thought I just mentioned that's here at UCLA that I think is especially valuable for anyone attending this evening. That's a thing known as socio-technical systems. It approaches the design of a society, for example, as if you were designing a bridge or designing a building. It takes a very, very structured standpoint, and in some ways it doesn't work. It is too much of a blackboard situation. But overall, again, you're trying to go and experiment. You're trying to go And instead of turning out a person who will follow orders, turning out a person who will try and develop new orders, in this case new living conditions. And this is the key thing now. You have a big block, in this case the needs of the urban world, which is a nice long-winded way of saying people have to have some sort of meaningful life on their own terms, that block. Then you have the university and the students all around who have to go and somehow be able to not only understand what that big block out there is, but be able to go and take it as if a lump of clay and shape it, and shape it with the people inside that lump at the same time. So that's kind of more an approach towards educating new architects now. Now, I think at this point might be an idea to see if there are any questions or any comments now, and then go and break up into the groups and see what can possibly be developed in the way of an urban problems-oriented architectural curriculum. See if people have any ideas. Are there any questions you would like to direct at any of the speakers at this point?
I'd like to. My name is Bill Smith at the Urban Workshop, Watts, California. And, man, this is terrible! I've never heard of such a thing my whole life. Do you realize the black community is over 65 to 70 square miles in this city? And we got one school of architecture. We got 250 black architects versus 34,500 white architects. We got a real problem. And the university is getting farther and farther away. I listened to Mr. Briggs, and he asked a very interesting question. He said, what is the relationship of architecture, and what does it affect on the community? Day after day after day, we see those kids come through. Hell, I gotta say this, that some of those kids do know what the word architecture is. They've heard of it, and they've shouted it. But, wow, it's a long way away from them. $60 a point for USC. Who can go there? New York City, it's got Columbia, both a day school and an evening school. It's got Pratt, Cooper Union. Guy can make something, go downtown, get involved, deeply involved in his city, and his board, and his work, come back to the university, day and night, be a part of it, of the real world, the theoretical world. He can go out in the scene. He's right in the urban environment. What do we have? We have nothing. We have guys come down, all the way down from St. Louis Obispo, 315 miles away. They came in today, bawled them out because they didn't make an appointment, and it really takes a lot of time, 2 hours at a time. Came down here 315 miles out of Morro Bay because they got to look at the urban scene 315 miles away, and we're right here, and we can't study it. We go out to Cal Poly, out there in Pomona, who are starting their fledgling school of architecture in their own way and doing a good job about it. 26 miles, we teach. It costs us a lot of our time running back and forth twice a week. I skip in with Gene, he skips in with me. And they come in. They're in a semi-rural, semi-urban scene, but they're getting more enlightened. They've got to have a school of architecture and undergraduate before you do. And an interesting thing is happening. The Urban Workshop next semester will be teaching its courses there. Very happy over that situation. But this this begins to look at a real need. You just can't train somebody in this university and then all of a sudden yank them out and come down there. It's a gradual process. Your real problem is with junior high school and high school kids. Hell, they can tell us. Professor Schwartz tells us up at Cal Poly, who's got 10 black students up there, the real problem is before they even got there. It takes a long time. Take a child. He has a hard visualization to even believe that he'll even finish high school. But once he's turned on, You really got an individual who really knows this community through some of the techniques that we have worked out at the workshop, through photographs, models, talking, listening. They're beginning to learn. They're beginning to affect. Well, we don't have money that we don't have a lot of that funding. A lot of that funding which takes us, which will allow us, it has to be a one-to-one relationship. Just the other day, he gave a small community job, of an architectural job, small community job to a local architect to do. He's a graduate architect, black one, and it took me 3 hours of my time to explain to him how to make his presentation, and it's his community, but I think we're on its way. And he's going to do that job, and he's going to come back and work through the workshop, and we're going to use every technique we can to work this out. It'll take about a year to do it, just one. It's a one-to-one relationship. Now, I'll tell you how you students can do it. I'll tell you how, because the students, the architectural students, the white architectural students that come down there, have a very interesting relationship. Since the directors don't have really too much time for them, the white architectural students can work a relationship out with the kids on their own level. We had this experience last summer when a guy came down from Cal Poly, stayed the workshop a whole summer, just slept and lived there. That was his whole thing for the summer. And he had a very interesting relationship. He was a fourth-year architectural student. He talked in terms of models, and he talked in terms of shapes, and it has to be a one-to-one relationship. That's why it's so expensive. You could blow $50,000 before you knew it. You could actually put a workshop out of business. But I just want to say one thing. It is a long, involved process. And I just wrote down here, I think the workshop is going to have a school of architecture. I think we're going to have it. But it's a slow process. That's all I want to say.
Well, I was going to add something to what Mr. Berland said. I picked you up when you were talking about historically the architect and the client. In other words, his client. And the interesting thing about that is that if you look at it from another angle of the past, which is always worthwhile looking at now and then, that if you think of all the governors and all the senators and all the congressmen and all the councils and all the Board of Education throughout the United States of America, you'll find that the amount of architects that ever entered this picture that knew anything about politics or anything about the community is practically zero. And this is part of the problem today of this whole architectural profession. We have to become conscious, not only of the community, but what the government and the whole thing is from the bottom up.
Yeah, well, I think my point was that in the past we never needed to.
But I just bringing out, I mean,
Yeah.
historically, there it is. Now you've got this that is part of curricula. You've got to become conscious.
Well, could I say something?
Yeah.
I'd like to not answer, but respond to what this gentleman, I'm sorry I didn't get your name.
Bill Smith.
Bill Smith, right. Bill Smith just said, because there's no question that what you're talking about is a very real thing. And I'd like to really carry it farther. I would say that my interpretation, I don't want to try to speak for you, but what you're saying is that it really has to do with the educational system in this country. The official, or let's say the traditional way of training people. I think that we have been, we'll say for at least the last 100 years, our educational system has been singularly lacking in anything which would sensitize or make appreciative the people who come up through it from 5 on to their environment, to their physical environment. It's rooted in the fact that education in America is based on verbal and mathematical reasoning almost to the exception of anything else, and that though both of these are very strong and important human intellectual powers, there is a third which is as important, certainly historically has been as important, and this is visual logic. But it was not recognized in our educational system. It was left out entirely. And I'm sure you've all had the experience who have children who pass through this phase. The children certainly are born with a very natural appreciation for their visual environment, and they solve many of their problems visually, long before they can write or add or subtract. And then gradually you can see this worked out of them by the school. The school gets them and teaches them to use visual logic, to verbal logic, mathematical logic, and gradually. Now, what happens then for anyone involved in design education of any kind is that you get them back at 17 or 20, whenever they finally come back into design education, and they're visually illiterate unless they've somehow managed to keep this alive, because certainly, you know, the few art courses they might take in high school are not going to be any great help. There's point number one. The other result of this system is that we as architects deal with clients, such as a bank president, who's an enormously powerful person, or president of a university, who is brilliant intellectually on the verbal reasoning level, but is 6 years old on the visual level. He also knows what he likes, but unfortunately he never developed beyond the age of 6. So that the real job, I think, in architectural education, call it what you want, environmental design education, begins back in day school and back in elementary school. We must find ways to get to children at the most tender age, really, and make them firstly appreciative of their visual surroundings in a conscious, intelligent way, make them proud of it. I mean, in Europe, for instance, this was never lacking. The reason that European cities may have lots of technical problems, like getting traffic through them, but aesthetically they've largely managed to maintain themselves, and there's certainly instances, for instance, in Florence, where the whole citizenry have risen up and with their bodies and hands have prevented the erection of some building along the Arno River, for instance, which was going to aesthetically offend them. So that in this country, we've never developed that kind of tradition, and I really think that now the best things that I know that are being done in environmental design education right now are being done at the elementary school level. Some of the work in Berkeley, for instance, some of the Berkeley elementary schools, some of the most successful programs are actually done with school children, getting them on the floor, covering the floor with enormous base maps, giving them crayons, giving them clay, giving them cardboard to work with, and let them feel that they can really manipulate their environment, that they're not inert victims of their environment, but they actually have something to say about it, and so forth. Well, I won't elaborate.
Could UCLA do something about that?
We're teaching at the graduate level. Okay,
no, but
forget
you're
answer,
teaching at the graduate level, but you happen to be responding to a theory of your own, which I recognized, for the children. And I asked you, could UCLA respond to the children? The hell with the graduates. Could they respond? Could your school go down and teach on the children's level, so when they do come up to that level, they are responsive and qualified? That's what I'm saying. Could you go down and take your maps and put them on the floor? Because I think that's delightful. I really do. When that kid looks 360 degrees all around in an area that's as flat as a pancake, man, that's delightful. I mean, he comes in the workshop and blows his mind because it's different.
It's very difficult to do something like that, though, when you have Max Rafferty getting as many points.
It's not difficult.
Yeah.
Not when you got potential.
No, I'm not trying to make excuses.
If a guy in my class at Cal Poly, a little old guy there, you know, is doing his thing in Venice Saturday and Sunday and every evening, and he can't finish his schoolwork because he has his embryo, the embryo of a workshop there. I can see it coming there. And he tells me the groups, he mentioned 10 groups last time, that the kids just, you know, just come. And it's beautiful. So it can be done. And he's doing it with nothing, right? And you guys have all the non-profit, tax-exempt, finest facilities at your disposal. That's what we're saying. And you could use it right. And Lord only knows those kids would love it. Look at, for instance, just the Hollywood area. It's got 3 regional cultural centers. Griffith Park, the Dance Center, Barnsdall Park. But who is it for?
I taught a class at Barnesville this last semester to elementary school children. They have
Good. I know they have one there. But who the hell can get there?
bring on a bus.
You bring them on a bus, right? Why don't you bring him down where it's at? Ask him. You got the capacity to do it. But you have to go out.
Well, do you really have that capacity? Aren't you somewhat controlled and restricted as to what you're going to use the funds made available by the regions for your department? How you're going to use them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to start making a series of excuses for what we're not doing. I mean, it could be that it's not what I had said with the importance of getting to elementary school children is somewhat different from busing our own students into the Watts Urban Workshop. I was really giving it a different interpretation to it. But I do think that it's possible that we are training the people right now who will be teaching those elementary school children at that level. And this is at least one way of getting at the problem. In fact, we have someone on our faculty right now who was doing precisely this back in Barna, Champaign, Illinois. He was working with elementary school children in an appreciation of the environment and of visual logic.
I'm an Australian architect, and I spent 7 years as an undergraduate, which is probably the longest that anybody has spent as an undergraduate. I spent 3 years of that time working in an office designing buildings at the same time as I was failing at the university in design. I'm very critical of undergraduate education back at home, and from what I've seen here of undergraduate education, I'm very critical of it here. In Australia, we haven't got such great differences in our school system as here, because we don't have school areas like here. But I have been interested in parts of Asia, and in India there is a population of 2 million refugees who haven't even got an infant school. In Australia, architecture there are more students leaving high school who make first preference to go into an architecture school than any other school, including arts and science. And in this situation, there's just not enough room for the students, and yet the standard of education in the schools of architecture does not use the sort of intelligence that the students have. We can discuss various things that architecture students at the undergraduate level can learn. And basically the sort of knowledge they want is of 3 kinds. There is facts, there is understanding, and there are methods. And I think that generally in schools of architecture that we have been trying to teach appreciation and understanding of the environment without the tools. Now, UCLA has just been accused of having all the facilities that could be available, but it does not. That we can't even simulate. We have nothing to simulate a design and to find out whether what we're doing is right or wrong. You take any other school within the university, they have laboratories to conduct experiments, and they have huge machines that have got fantastic capacity to do just what they want. But traditionally, schools of architecture have one thing, and that's faculty. In our school, we have trouble with a Xerox machine, but we shouldn't have trouble with it. What we should be having is equipment where we can actually know what we're doing. We can't appreciate environments until we see what we're supposed to be appreciating. One method is to go out into the community, but from my experience, going out into the world tends to be a slow way of learning, generally, because you get stuck in a groove. Wherever you go outside, you get stuck in a groove. You've got a job to do, and you only see a certain distance outside that. But in the university, this is where you can apply yourself fully and wholeheartedly to the job of learning and understanding. Now, I think you need to do that with glimpses of the real world and make sure that what you're doing is realistic. Now, that is absolutely essential. But and the outside projects are good, but only if they're tied in to a system which has got the financial backing, has got the methods and the systems and things to make this a realistic evaluation situation. Schools of architecture generally have faculty which, in the undergraduate level, even in this country, like at home, a very lot of faculty are just people who don't make it in practice. As a broad generalization. This is in undergraduate schools. The people who teach design are so very often the people who cannot design. The old George Bernard Shaw statement. But I think that's on the faculty level. And then the things that these people have to teach with, their style of teaching, is by walking around from student to student, looking over their shoulder, looking at crude drawings and trying to assess from these drawings what the student is doing. When what could be done is they could be teaching and simulating and modeling and going out and erecting real buildings or really seeing what the real world is like. They could be doing so much more than what is being done. And this is basically what I feel about the standpoint as it is now.
I think this is okay.
I'd just like to pick up a couple of points you said. Because when I was at school, I know one of the keywords was simulation. Others were models, you name them. When I got out into the real world, I found that what the hell do you need simulation for? There's people there just waiting. I'm not talking about computers and things. There's plenty of people just waiting. The second point is, when you do get out into the real world, you're talking about constraints, having the blinkers on. I was like that for a while. I worked for a firm called William L. Pereira and Associates. That's why I went back into school and decided, I don't want the blinkers on outside, I don't want them inside. So when I came out, I went looking. And I think you just keep on having to look until you find what you want. You don't have to accept what's given. And I know with my of the 11 students that graduated, I only know one who's working in a traditional office with the blinkers on. All the other 10 students are doing wild and wonderful, crazy things.
I think at this point it might be a good idea to get this type of a discussion going in more intimate surroundings of about 6 or 7 people each. At the same time, out of the discussions kind of evolve some now, instead of staying just on the critical level, get into a more analytical one, and in fact possibly come up with some ideas, some potential solutions to all of the problems that quite obviously this evening have been presented in pretty thorough depth. I think it might be an idea, to go and divide up as follows: kind of each panelist kind of handling a group. Pinky's group, which I think it might be an idea to simply take some chairs and group around this table here. How about Mrs. Contini, Friedman, Ms. Cohen, Ron, you two. And, yeah.
You try pressing groups?
Yeah, I think at this point it would be a good idea to get into groups. What? Yeah, if you want to, sure. Okay. It's recommendations. In fact, there are about 25 people here, so that breaks down into about 6 groups per person. Yeah. Okay. In John's group, I think have Owen, Mr. Borok, Jerry, Art, Mr. Marin, and Mr. Smith. In Pinky's group, this is Mr. Contini, Mr. Friedman, Mike, and Ron. In Professor Vreeland's group, like Mr. Gershny, Mr. Kawan, Mr. Evanson, Benny, and Wayne. In mine, I'll go with Mr. Love, Mr. Hornbostel, Professor Burns, Lee, Professor Mr. Gary, and I don't know your name. Miss next to Wayne. Anyway, and you, okay? So at this point, I think it'd be best if we broke it down.
I think before we broke, I think we should find that if there's any other questions,
Yeah.
come up. Let's go right into the groups and then open it up.
Yeah.
How about tearing in the university and starting over? Would anybody sanction that?
You're a graduate student at
History at UCLA.
Henry, what are you? I'm the president of the Pico Union Neighborhood Council. I'm very pleased to meet you, in which case. My pleasure.
Well, yes, pre-approved land.
Any more?
So if you weren't here,
That's extremely valuable. What's the action? Create an environment to teach around. Create an environment to teach around. Every time you walk out this goddamn building, man, you're visually raped. You relate to the what we're real world. That shit outside.
That's a good idea.
Well, to start with a curriculum, let's throw it out and start over again and say that whatever's in there now. That's why I was asking.
Okay. I think that.
Say what you like. I'm the one who's going to say these schools.
Perhaps the schools of architecture, we should do our best to influence the progression from the start, from basic bottom level education, and at the same time internally we've got to form a break, after which we then evolve from what we're not now but we should be now, to what we can be when the school system bucks up and wakes up to itself.
Well, I'll tell you something right now. Unless you want to renovate the whole school system, which I think would be an excellent idea, you're going to have to stick to the graduate schools of architecture as far right now.
And undergraduate.
I came to listen.
And undergraduate
university.
University.
Now, but you can, just as a way of an addendum, a note, I think we can affect the school system. I think the school system is slowly adjusting, very slowly, and not really fast enough, but I think it is adjusting. I haven't seen many schools yet in the United States, but every one that I've had a look at, are beginning to start out on this more creative, environmental sort of thing.
So I'm not too interested in where they're at now and where they're going. I mean, back in England, university students are building buildings. Architectural students. I think, what we try and do is just write down a series of things that you believe should be in the curriculum.
Well, this is where...
what should be? What is it? What should it be? How can you relate to it in practice?
It's going to be very hard in this discussion not to get hung up on the old thing of teaching design, and if we can get around that problem and just say we will, assuming that in a school of design you can teach design by X method, that what else does a school need other than teaching design, and how do these affect the way design is being taught?
Imagination?
I think that,
to begin with?
I think imagination, and in other words stimulus for imagination, is what the school can provide. It can
Well,
provide
in order to do that, you first have to have imagination and creativity on the part of the faculty?
Of everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, let's presume that the educational school system preceding the undergraduate level, university level, has stifled creativity, which in the public school system in Los Angeles, which is what I'm associated with, has done. Let's just presume it isn't there.
Okay, fair enough.
You're not,
It gives us a standard.
No, because if it is there, you have to make a statement.
It's suppressed. I mean, I'm sure that there's something.
Okay.
How do you awaken
Assuming that
17-year-olds?
we've got to awaken, we've got to re-arouse this consciousness of environment and the whole concept of creativity.
I keep getting lost with that word environment.
Oh, well, it's just been whatever's around you, just what's around you.
Yeah, but as that kept being related to tonight, environment, if we're gonna relate it to what's around us, I think we're gonna be in pretty piss poor shape. Because that's the problem. That's the problem. Out there is the problem. We got to look for solutions.
There's two problems. One is what the environment looks like, and the other thing is we don't see the environment.
No, of course not. I put up a screen every morning. When I drive the freeway, I'm visually raped. I don't want to really look at it. There's nothing to look at.
But in this, the student has got to be brought aware of environment. In other words, aware of what's around about him, and then he's got to be aware. He's got to be able to evaluate and realise how bad what around him is, and be able to discover what is better around him, or how he can make things better around him. In other words, the school itself, he's got to be able to do things in the school which make things better.
I agree. It's utopian, though.
A school of architecture, as far as the building is concerned, should be a nothing thing, and where each student starts putting in what's good. Whereas schools of architecture, as buildings generally are hard things that you can't move. Ours up here is like that. We can't do it. We can barely do a thing with it. We haven't got money to even buy a paintbrush in order to paint it, let alone anything else. The Yale School, the only way the Yale School is becoming more flexible is because it was burnt down. They're starting again. But there is architecturally supposedly a magnificent building. But as far as teaching the student environment and appreciation of environment, the student can't push anything, he can't move it, he can't see how he can affect his environment. And
let's come back to a couple of basics. One is, do you think the existing educational system equips an architectural student to go out to the world and handle himself?
No, definitely not. On just about any point.
Is he being taught the wrong things?
He is being taught many wrong things, but basically he is not being he's not being taught things in the, first of all, his context. I think he's being taught just about everything in the wrong context. I think the context is wrong.
What's the context?
Well, generally he's taught it in a context which is unrelated to anything, let alone the real world.
Is it highly theoretical, highly intellectualized?
Oh, if it was intellectualized, that would be bliss. It's all, in my experience, is a lot of architectural schools, undergraduate schools, are almost anti-intellectualized. Well, they were 5 years ago, and now, generally, throughout the world, they're slowly starting to get more intellectualized in some areas.
Well, wait a minute. I guess at my concept of the word, can you define that? I'm not familiar exactly with what the curriculum is, and that's why I was asking.
generally the teaching of design has been based on subjective evaluation upon insufficient evidence. In other words, relating to scientific method. So by intellectual, I mean, in this context, I mean something like scientific method. And in schools of architecture, things have been done without sufficient reason or without sufficient evidence. And that's even on the imagination level. It's even on the simply creative level. It's like painters cannot paint until they know about the substance of the paint they're using. And this is taking it purely on the creative level. If you forget about building materials and sociology, forget about these things, even on the most elementary form, it is anti-intellectual, or has tended to be. Now there's a lot of, historically now there's a lot of opposition to this, and the swing is to become rational and to become more intellectual and approach things from cool, calm, collectively thing. You get design methodologies. You get a lot more sociology type courses taught in schools.
Okay, on this point,
but
what use is it? What uses scientific methods,
Mm-hmm.
methodologies,
I would have thought that would really be
well,
rigid.
I thought these things I criticise in that, firstly, the places the sort of sociology they teach is very out of context teaching sociology, and this is where I think that sociology is one thing where if the teaching in the classroom is closely linked with the real world and actually going down into meeting people, this is somewhere where I think
that's bullshit. I think that's bullshit. You learn to be a sociologist outside. You know, the school ain't going to teach you. Sociologist says, you know, he just sees the problem and he tries to help. You know, that doesn't need a school.
In fact, it's laboratory solves the problem.
It's not solving any problem, you know, sociology and community, and that's bullshit.
I think that where it is valuable is it helps the student understand the structure of the environment he's working with. Sorry, I'm using that terrible word again. It teaches the student something about people, and that when he gets out and is practicing, then he's able to relate this back. But the trouble with sociology as it's taught is that it isn't. Nobody's got a creative feeling about sociology.
Yeah, but how's that dealing with architecture and new directions in architectural education?
Well,
you know, it's really hard.
To me, I'm concerned with bigger groups. Now,
what bigger groups? I don't know what you mean.
Well, in my previous experience in work, I have worked with the Australian Aborigine, the New Guinea natives, and I've worked with schools. And there's the three basic areas that I've worked with. And one of the things that prevented me working was that, or slowed me down in my work, is that I was not able to comprehend everything I saw. And when I was speaking to an Australian Aborigine, I didn't know the sort of questions I should ask him or an approach. Now, if I had linked together my work with some sort of, if I'd worked then with people who knew and had studied the Australian Aborigine, if I'd worked with those people.
But you're getting to know them when you're with them.
You know. No, but I can only be with 2, 3, 5 people.
Or you can be with someone who's completely disassociated. You're taking, taking his word as a credential. That's bullshit.
No, but you see, here's
but
both. No, I should.
The other 3 million.
But
Really?
I can get. No, I need both. I want both. I don't just want one. I want both.
I'm saying the one gives you the other.
At least, the out in front association, with whoever, it'll give you a better basis to evaluate what this other dude's talking about.
Yeah.
It gives you a better basis.
I'll
on
agree
that.
with what you said. Yes, but that's because it's exactly what I think. That's exactly what I was saying. I can't just take a course on sociology and plug it in. That's why I'm in school. I'm back in school, was because I feel that now I've got my experience. I can now go and have this seminar and get this guy to tell me a few things, because instead of just taking that knowledge, which is meaningless, it now, in context of my previous experience, at least has a little bit of meaning.
How about jumping right now to how do you think the architectural curriculum can relate? Well, first of all, should it? And if it should, how can it relate to the urban crisis?
We're talking mainly about undergraduate.
No, any level of architectural education.
Well,
PhD, if you want.
I think definitely yes.
I think it definitely should relate, to the urban crisis. But I think that certain students, I don't think it should be, students should be forced to necessarily work on the urban crisis, but I think that they should work in the urban crisis, but not necessarily on the urban. Do you get the distinction?
Yeah. I mean, if someone wants to be an academician, there's no point in going out in the real world.
Right.
But he should know what's there.
So I think they should go out in the real world.
Now, this is slightly...
A lot of things, the problems I get right now is the distinctions you make between the real world and the world you're talking about. And see, that becomes a real problem because it becomes a semantic term when you use the definition of the real world. It almost says that, what are you envisioning as far as the world you're talking about? Is it a set of constructs which only exist in your mind, and that it's almost a utopian dream, whereas that it seems to me that everything that was brought up tonight seemed to state, one, that even though that a lot of people are committed towards addressing themselves towards the problems of the urban crisis, they don't have the means to even implement that which they see as necessary. It seems to me also that we have to talk about, in terms of the urban crisis, is let's look at that situation in some kind of context, be it the academician kind of approach, or the academic approach. And we could see the urban crisis also relates to the problems of population and pollution, and to me it also goes into a kind of mentality which seems to tie in with the idea of development and underdevelopment, that is, the position of the United States with respect to foreign countries. And it seems to me all these mentalities seem to come together in some kind of problem which finally manifested itself in the urban crisis. That is, we started out in about the 60s with the idea of the urban crisis. Today we talk about the problems of pollution and population. We've also gone through in the period of the 60s the idea of saying our position with respect to Vietnam, and I think they are all tied together because they tie together kind of a sick kind of economic system which puts the priorities on one, profit, two, it puts on a priority on the idea of saying an assumption of private.
That's sort of statement I make on the individual has. The individual has been happy from being there when I'm talking about how capital sets full train fabrication, technique, whatever. And you do have to realize this, and realize that that's otherwise you're going to have LA, and you can't have LA anywhere else. I think the world, is going to face a very bad because there's no doubt about it. How can you stop it? And then you come into America. Well, America is completely different from, for instance, from European countries, Australia, whatever. They're much more socially minded. Americans call it, it's not. It's a fantastic difference. It's like the Democratic Party here is like Conservative Party back home. But the first thing you've got to do, and this is probably the most difficult, is make everybody aware of the situation, including the profit-motivated people. And I think that's probably the biggest problem. How people like Ford, General Motors, all the defense people, even the government, because the government is one of the worst cohorts.
Right. The government
you
is
just have to look at the
70
70 billion it gives out to people like military. What does it do? Out of that you probably find there's 10 billion in profit.
Okay, granted, I don't disagree with it.
So how can you do it? Really, I haven't finished. All I know is that I know some business people who are making profit who all also have a social conscience. One of the ways of doing this is that they're in a community. Communities basically at a higher density. They relate to other people in the community. LA in its suburbs, you don't relate to anybody. Except we're in an automobile and he might be on the other side of the mountain.
Does that have to do with, do you think that, let me explain let me pose a question there. Do you think that can you kind of distinguish the kind of alienation you're speaking about? What do you relate that to? How do you explain that? Do you think that's a product of suburbs? Is it a product of industrialization? What do you see that as? And how do you as an architect
alienation is the development of man.
Is the natural development? Is it a Western thought or is it an Eastern thought? Eastern thought doesn't seem to have too much alienation.
I think it's a technical thought. I think it goes on with technological development. That's what's happening. And if you look at the countries that are behind the times, they don't think this way. The problem is countries like America are influencing these countries in American ways, which are not necessarily good. In fact, I don't think they are.
I see. In fact, that possibly... See, it seems to me that what's interesting is the fact that we say, we're so far advanced, you say, like we're saying, the country... You said the statement of those countries that are so far behind, there was a value judgment there. Like, it seems to me that in Africa or Asia or some of these other areas which are, quote, underdeveloped, they don't seem to have the problems of alienation, one. In fact, thinkers such as McLuhan and others say that, in fact, it seems their kind of mentality, their kind of way of perceiving things might fit even better with the idea of saying industrialization in highly technical societies. How do you correlate that?
I personally...
Or do you believe that thought?
No. Yeah, to a certain extent, yeah. I think that when I talk about advanced country, you might start looking at people like Sweden and not America. I don't think America's advanced. Technically, it's very advanced. In every other aspect, it's not. And that's why there's an urban crisis situation. Stronger in this country. Stronger in this country than any other country. I think you can learn a lot of things from countries like Africa. The point is you have to reinterpret this into the 20th century, and no one has been able to do this successfully.
Can architects do that or help with that?
I don't think architects should. I think architects basically are not so concerned with people, but with the built environment. They're not experts in people. I don't know anybody who is an expert in people.
Right, but doesn't the environment... What are the effects of the environment? Like, obviously, certain architects try to help in the sense of the aesthetics. Certain kinds of aesthetics do affect the mentality of the people. And we're talking about the quality of life here. And the quality of life obviously has to be tied in with, their situation as far as where they sleep. The idea of leisure time is if leisure time is such a large part of the new technical society, that has to be increased. And also in the kind of society you're talking about, there has to be, I think, the idea of saying how do architects help in the redistribution of wealth in one hand, and also saying bringing people up to the level which seems to be, that is, the necessary qualities for life, that is food in a certain level, shelter, which helps in the aesthetic sense because of the alienation that helps overcome those. How do we overcome those?
Actually, the problem that is facing the world happens to be a problem that architects, especially architects related to architectural education.
Architects have run away from the problem.
Yeah.
To run away from the problem. Architects have run away from the problem.
Yeah. But historically, but the students.
What are you talking about?
Could he explain that? Wait, let him explain that. I'd like to
take a look around.
I think so, and you just clarify that. I think that'd be very, very important to his point of view. That is that I agree with you very, very much, and that seems to me why the real world has to be tied in with the kind of world you're talking about.
Utopia.
Not utopia in any sense. That is, like, it seems to me that says that in a lot of ways that the kind of education that we seem to be giving is miseducation in a lot of ways. That is, it has no kind of social conscience because it seems to talk about, the kinds of models you're talking about, which don't even relate to the needs of people. And I think that's more important than saying, what are the basic essential needs of people? Also in the psychic sense, since our society is so highly technically advanced that it seems to be producing alienation in terms of one, leisure time, that is, the people seem to be, there is a great amount of feeling that we're victims of our fates. Even the architects that spoke tonight seemed to express that. They said, we have no political power. We don't know how, decisions are made in this country. Or we don't even have the economic access.
I didn't hear that, but I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it.
Did they ever in this country?
Ever have it?
I think that architects,
Well, I think so.
architects have traditionally been slaves in every country, except for a few isolated great men, and they just do as they're told. But now, and at this point in history, I think in many places,
decorators.
That's right. But in many places there is a growing consciousness, just like this coming out tonight. And the number of times you've met with a group of architectural students led by Akima or Van Eyck or any one of these men. This is the sort of thing that they've discussed, and it's all talk at the moment and not action. Now, I think that architects, in order, this is sort of talking in terms of what we've been talking about now, have got to be prepared to make a decision, and that is that then they might be concerned about food, they might be concerned about education, but their job is to build, and that's their job, is to build an environment, and that if they become interested in food and education, well, then they become food people and education people.
I don't know, because then it's just too goddamn limiting, No, can't buy it.
Well,
I don't think that places, the parameters are just too, the constraints there.
Well, it's the constraints. The constraints aren't narrow. In fact, we're talking about what you're going to have time to learn about.
Yeah, build one for who?
Build homes for the millions, or build schools and build hospitals, build things that are needed.
Yeah, but I agree, but it's like, what comes into play there, and I think that's food, and that comes,
food does come in, it relates.
I think there are a lot of things come in. I think to answer some of your points, the architect has lost not the hold, but the capacity he had way back in the old days. Take someone like Michelangelo, who is an architect, who was a master builder, he was a painter, he could do practically everything. What can an architect do today? He's lucky if he can draw well. And I think, the control of the architect back in the old ages had over the total environment is totally different from today.
Yeah.
The value society placed on the architect in those days was practically as a godlike figure, and it's not anymore. He's just someone who's paid a buck and employed by a client, and basically has zero control over the environment. Control. He builds the environment, but he has no control over it. And, to a certain extent, you're right. The person who does have the control over the environment nowadays is the guy who has the green buck. And this is where I think society's gone sour. Mm-hmm. You now don't have national goals until the problem is created. Then you start coming in with national goals like pollution control, but it's too late, it's here. It's like the car system.
Sure.
The car is running over everybody. You go down to City Hall and the car comes before the people. Every statement they make, car comes before people. Why? Suddenly people are second-class citizens, third-class citizens. Mechanization's #1 citizen. Computerization, you name it. And scientific research now is the thing.
It's the thing, yeah.
You're not anybody unless you're doing research. That again is crazy. Research is getting away from people. And I think there's no hope for the world. There is really no hope for the world unless people can come back to realize that people make up the world and must control the world. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that.
You believe, in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, the more and more I go along with school and everything else, it seems to me that a lot of the concepts of Marx and the ideas in one distribution, maybe they're somewhat outdated because, like, what seems to me is very interesting is the fact that you say Michelangelo had very much control because he was looked upon, but then we could say, okay, who were the people that actually could hire Michelangelo and who had control in those situations, like it was somewhat a feudal situation. And then we said as society progressed through various stages, we could look at the changes as far as historical roles of architects. I don't know that well. Like saying Da Vinci might be considered an architect, but he'd be considered a lot of other things, as would Michelangelo, right? So it seems to me that architects in those periods weren't just merely architects, they were people with so much more. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, that's what I was saying, basically, when I was saying what an architect was in those days.
They didn't have control over their artistic creations either.
It was not for them. They always sold it, and it was patrons, etc. Could you explain that for me? Clarify?
Leonardo da Vinci, and full stop. Or Brunicelli, perhaps. And then after that, then you get the master builders from the Gothics built there.
You can go back to those times, and who are the people you remember? They are people like that.
Yes, but there's not many of them.
Who today are you going to remember? You're going to remember the people who landed on the moon.
I don't think so. Do you realise that the first man who stepped on that moon, that great step of man, was backwards off the ladder? Isn't that beautiful? That step on the moon was backwards. That's marvellous. Sorry about that.
Sorry. America put in there. I think the detrimental thing was that they hung up an American flag.
Or Nixon's signature too.
Oh, please.
As if everybody didn't know it was America up there in the first place.
And then in order to make the flag stay up, they polluted the atmosphere, or the lack of atmosphere. Now, coming back you're conscious of these things that you've been talking about. You're out in practice in the big bad world. Now, how do you relate these things to what you're doing now? What you have learnt that's relevant, what you haven't learnt that's relevant?
Well, I can tell you what I have learned that is relevant. That is, I was 7 years in architectural school, including 2 graduate courses, and I could have done the same in 4. And I was quite easily have had it, no problem at all.
I'm in my 10th year now, and
that's number 1. That basically means
I could have done it in 4 too.
That basically means the education system is wrong. I want to make that clear. So when I went out, I didn't have any clear conception, and I received a great education. I knew when I went out in the world, there's a lot of things I could learn. I've learned more in the last year than I learned in the last 2 years at UCLA. I've learned a lot of things about politics, which makes the country run. You have to know about politics if you want to be able to do anything at all. You have to know what backdoor politics is. You have to realize that this country is corrupt and most politicians are bought. Politicians don't live on the salary they're given by the city or state or the federal government. They live on something else, like contributions, a nice term. You can go through East LA and see Snyder's white picture up on all the billboards, donated free. Why? Because every time billboard company goes to city council, Snyder gets up and says, we need billboards. I mean, that's the kind of philosophy that big business is into nowadays. And unfortunately, politicians are into this kind of big business, and they're nowhere near as aware as they were in the early days. I don't think, coming back to Michelangelo, although there were some great visionary people in those days, really great, much more than there are or have been in the last century, but also the poor people, the more people than Michelangelo, also had greater visualization than people do today. You just have to look at the Italian hillside town. There's something about it. Architects keep talking about, building that again today. This is nonsense. Of course you don't. You don't go back and build the same as you built yesterday just because it's successful. What you have to do is look at it, analyze it, and try and find out why it was successful. And I think one of the reasons is why the people in those days were much better educated in their awareness to the environment than they are today. You just have to go to the valley and talk to a person about the environment. He'll look at you and say, what?
Right.
And nowadays, he's so instilled with... Nowadays, he'll say pollution.
You won't say what, you'll say what.
But environment.
What cracked me up is all these engineers that I used to work with, when we were dealing with the system when it was happening, and we're going to space, and they all lived in the valley in these boxes, you know, with no concept of space, no concept of dimension. You know, it was really ridiculous. And here we're going to space, you know, and you're confined.
That's because they always thought space was a vacuum. But, but see, what
I've met some students up the road who think that way. You don't talk about space, you talk about vacuums. People move in vacuums, and that's the only way you can relate, when there are no constraints on yourself, and when you can think that way. Yeah,
that's why it's so hard to get them off their inertia, yeah. But see, what I really wonder about, saying, like, the same kind of question which a lot of us are facing as far as saying create, you know, solve solutions to the urban crisis and solutions to so many other problems. That is, I'm saying, are we that are doing, you know, some of these projects like Head Start or any other governmental kind of funded agency, are we merely trying to patch up something which, you know, is just too far gone in a lot of ways? Are we creating band-aids? What are they going to be the necessary kinds of changes? What does it mean that we have to have a complete change as far as man's attitudes? Because it seems like during the Industrial Revolution, people couldn't catch up, and the people that did and created the cities like some cities in England did go through those problems, like the change from ruralism to the idea of urbanism, created problems where a lot of people died out. And are we going through that same kind of process now?
I think there is probably only one solution that would save mankind. It's very seriously now. And that is if you reverse the military budget and HUD's budget. Reverse it. Spend all the military budget, just as they did on the Moon Project, in research to create the environment that man can live in. So instead of spending it,
complex.
It doesn't matter what it is. You know, it's open. You don't have to define it. You just start from zero. And what was the Moon's goal? Land on the Moon. That was it. There was nothing else. And I think we should do exactly the same with the environment. The goal should be create an environment that everybody could live in.
Could I bring up one point, John? I think that one thing wrong is I think that in America we set that up, it'd be almost like saying the same approach that we took towards poverty. We considered it a war on poverty. We'd probably consider it a war on environment. See, that's our mentality.
Really?
See, Dig, we consider it a war on environment. And I think it's kind of the mentality we take in a lot of ways. And like saying that, like, I'm really impressed, like, with what you stated and like a lot of other things that are going around, but it seems to me that a lot of the other people that are here, that is the people from the private firms, still are deeply entrenched in their ideas. They don't have any of the ideals, and they don't have to live in the environment that they create.
Exactly.
That is that.
Unfortunately, you're right. And not only that, I can bet you that 70% of the students on campus are that way as well.
I'd say higher than 70.
Well, I would. I like being 70.
Do we know?
The South Bay Club.
You don't have to go to the offices. It's here on campus where you're supposed to be educated.
Right, see, like the same kind of mentality. See, that's what I wanted. Like, he brought up the point of saying, we are going to do something as far as building the third world college or whatever he stated. What he didn't bring up was the fact that the universities are cutting on capital outlay towards the building funds. That's getting completely cut.
Yeah, but he also didn't say what the third world college really is.
Yeah.
And what his input really
about
is.
third world students being involved.
And so, like, saying what's happening in the state, and then also saying the state of the environment and everything else. That is that, like, people like Ehrlich, that is people that have visions in a lot of ways. Their visions tend to be fatalistic. That is, can make quite a few changes quickly, or change our priorities right now, or else we'll have to face the consequences of our inaction almost. Not our action, but our inaction.
I think, architecture probably has to go in the way that some people like archigram are thinking, although not necessarily that kind of product. And that is, you have to have architecture that responds to the human being. It has to be totally flexible. You don't have to have walls, You just have to have a machine. It has the machine, and you can do anything with it. You can change its shape, you can change the shape. You don't even have to walk on the floor, you should be able to walk on the ceiling. You should be able to do what you want.
That's nice.
You don't necessarily, you can cook or you don't have to cook. If you're hungry, just press a button and you're not hungry. You can do this kind of thing. The technology is there, it just hasn't been applied. See, at the moment, we have no control over the environment once it's built, i.e. this room. And if you come around and want to remove that wall, it's a 2-month process. It shouldn't be. It should be a press button process, just like the television set. 13 channels, you can change them in a second. You should have a room that you can change into, not just change the space of the room, but the environment in that space. change the colours.
How important this is to have this, first of all, in the School of Architecture, where the students can do this and appreciate and be exposed to it. And this is what I meant by simulation. And you got hung up in it because you
I think it's
simulation. We're used to game theory and stuff like that when you talk about simulation.
I'm thinking of simulation in the way Peter Kempson looks at it. Okay,
you know what, I work on Intubal, would you believe? But you know, by simulation, I meant a much bigger thing than that. I meant walking into real rooms, a real appreciation. To simulate a building, the best way to do that is to build it. And I still term this as a simulation because the reason why you're building it, is to appreciate it, and not. That's why. In a School of Architecture, the reason why a student should build is so that he appreciates what he's doing. And I think
they should all go out to see Solari's earth houses. Now they're fun. They're real fun.
What are
Solari? He built these earth houses. They're just a gas. It's really a nice total environment.
Because that's what we're talking about, total environment in a lot of ways. That is that. One thing about what I really impressed by your thought is that when you talk about total environment, you're talking about much more than, just small rooms or anything else. Because it seems to me that we have to talk about total environment. Total environment means, to me, which is really hard to conceptualize, that total environment means just even the way people have to interact and the way they have to keep from bouncing into each other so they don't get on each other's nerves. That seems to be one of the problems of saying.
Yeah, I think
those problems.
You can even talk about total environment in the Buckminster fuller sense, although I think he does it all wrong. You can create a dome, which automatically makes everything artificial. Great. So then, once it's artificial, you can do exactly what you want. His problem is that he puts it over the built environment. You shouldn't. You should put it over the desert. Put the people in and leave them to it, and see what happens. That is, their total environment. They created it.
Well,
you have quite a bit of trust in mankind.
Basic trouble.
No, I have.
How do you do that? How do you put that in? I don't understand that if you don't have.
I would choose the people I go in there with.
See, that's what I mean.
Well, you see, Los Angeles is a desert that somebody's put a dome over and let the people do what they like.
That's almost like Arthur C. Clarke's saying of Childhood's End. Have you read that? Of saying, God,
no, I don't. I think
it's almost an overlord dome.
Yeah. No, I think you have to be basically accept the situation you're in, like in school. You accept, your 32 classmates. Now, if you're looking at the experimental schools, they basically let those children do exactly what they want.
Yeah.
In fact, now they're not thinking of teaching grade K through 6. They say, well, just find your own circle. The teachers are there, they're giving the classes, come and listen to whatever you want. Now we're getting around to responsive education. The child can go and get what he wants, not what we force upon him.
Hey John, do you think that those kinds of
institutions, right now,
almost all those kinds of institutions you're talking about are almost either counter institutions or they're separated from the institutions that exist? It seems to me, how do you foresee, your kinds of visions, are they going to happen quickly enough to be incorporated into this kind of institution?
No.
It seems to me, no.
See,
how are you
what is really happening
is separated from our terms of referencing and
let me just be clear. I think what simply is going to happen is the world's going to go downhill until it reaches a point where it's just about to drop off, the continental shelf into the chasm. All of a sudden you realise, oops, we're just about to go.
You're optimistic.
All the money will suddenly come in, and we'll stay on the brink for the next 2,000 years.
You're optimistic.
But coming back to something you said quite some time ago, was that you spent 7 years studying when it could have been 4. And then you said...
I spent 8.
And I said... anyway...
going up.
Firstly, you said you should learn about politics. And you said in what you said before, you mentioned just the whole problem of financing. And you mentioned materials and methods and factory techniques. And you mentioned getting the people to understand. I think those are the words you used. And then you talked about the interdisciplinary effort. There's a number of the things which you did mention. I think that unfortunately, it sounds as if I'm cutting off everything we've said and talking about something else, but I don't think I am. I think that this is coming back, what can we do now in schools of architecture? And what we can do is we can introduce topics for just straight out dog learning, which are relevant to the problems which architects face. And these are ones which I'll agree that I've come across in my practice, and that are frightfully important. And we tend to have got, in this conversation, just been talking about people and politics, but money and materials and policies and approaches are all very important as well.
Let me just say one thing. I think it's sacrosanct that the architect is not in control of anything he does. It's that simple. Why? I think politics is one of the extremely important reasons why. He doesn't understand it, he doesn't get involved in it, he doesn't know what politics are about. Unless you do, you're not going to control a thing. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, right. Same idea of the idea of the educator who thought that he could educate without having any idea of what he was talking about and what kinds of effects it would have in reality. It seems to me the idea of saying, like, everybody else talked about the responsibility, and that seems to me the major kind of word now, because conscience and consciousness seems to imply a word of responsibility. Yeah, it seems to be the major word that we have to face right now, because it seems to me that right now, if we look at everything the way it goes, nobody's responsible for anything, so we can't put our finger on anybody. That's one reason why we have a fatalistic approach.
No, a lot of people are responsible, but they're not guilty.
Yes. Okay, that might be the same thing.
Because they're part of the system.
Okay, well,
the system predicates that you're not guilty.
Nuremberg said otherwise, but, you know.
The truth of the matter is exactly the other way around, isn't it? Everybody's guilty, but nobody's responsible. Coming to another issue, another way of looking at this is architects don't know what they're doing. When they put up a building, they just know what they've put on a piece of paper and in a book, and they don't know what the thing they're doing is. And I think that if they did know what they were doing, then that would be the beginning of getting more power. Okay, well, that would be a good start.
Yeah, let me go back a second. You know, I gave this list in this order because I think this is a priority order, and the architect doesn't come in until you get down to designing, and then starting talking about mundane things like materials and prefabrication of materials. I think after politics, you have to realize that the client controls the architect. Why? Because he has the greenback, and the greenback pays the architect. Yeah. So how do you get the greenback? You have to, first of all, understand economics. You show me one architect that understands economics. Not one. So he not only doesn't understand politics, he doesn't understand economics.
I've been trying to understand that financial section.
You tell an architect to go out and say, oh look, I've got a client, he wants $10 million. Where can I get it from? An architect will say, I don't know. And then he says, well, it's only going to cost this much. No more than $50,000 a year. Borrowing. He couldn't even think. He can't get off the line. The client is a guy who does that. He knows exactly where to put his hand on the money, how much it's going to cost him, whether it's economical, whether it's feasible or not. Could an architect do a feasibility study? No. So he's automatically out on the limb. He can't but help be the underdog because he doesn't understand what the client is handing down to him. It's as simple as that. The client understands everything below him and also everything above him. That's why he's the client. An architect, only stands everybody that's below him.
He's a technician.
I think that's a relevant point that John made in involving oneself, an architectural student involving oneself in a non-profit corporation, because then you're part of the complete process.
Yeah.
And it broadens the whole.
I spent one summer in New Guinea as a voluntary architect. I was just a student, but I went up there, and the job which the two architecture students, me and my mate, were involved in was we went out to a completely remote area, and we had to work out how on earth this group of poor people could afford medication, could afford hygiene, and the whole problem there was understanding the people, understanding their whole economic situation, understanding the materials which were available to them, understanding the government in order to try and wangle anything we could from the government, and I learnt more in that short period of time in which we ended up with no money at all. We ended up building a hospital without any money, a police station without any money. We ended up for $30 providing villages with water to each village. And villages, some of them had to go 4 miles.
Money gets in your way. A lot of times it usually does.
Yeah. Let me just make one suggestion on how I think you could change some aspect of the educational system. When I was at school, the time when I really learned, after the first educational class input, which I think everybody needs, was when I wrote my own program, because I was on my own. I had responsibility and I had to handle it, and if I wasn't successful, I only had myself to blame. I think this is the way education should go, especially in graduate school. You shouldn't sit down and be taught. This is the time...
Unless that's the only way you can get the information.
Yeah, because... No, wait a minute. Because I think what you can really do, and what you should do, is you say to the students, okay, for the next 6 months, you're on your own. Go out. Here's a problem. You solve it. If you want help, come and get it.
Yeah, that's it.
Make the architectural student swim. Make him swim. It's like teaching a non-swimmer how to swim. He's a non-swimmer. Stick him out. Swim. And the guy behind you is only to help you when you're just about to get drowned. That's the only way you're going to learn, and that's the way I've learned. I've learned more in the last year because I've been on my own, and I've got no one to answer to but myself. I have to make it work. I don't just have the responsibility. If I don't make it work, I have to get out quick. And I think this is where the student is. You shouldn't send a student out in the community and have a professor sitting on his back evaluating him. Evaluation, and research, two of the UCLA's unique tools, sacrosanct tools, are obsolescent.
Yeah. I'll wholeheartedly agree with that.
You should just kick a guy in the community, and it doesn't matter if he comes back with something valid or not. I tell you, he's learned more than he did in school.
See, this is what happened in my undergraduate experience. I failed one year, and I had to swim because I had to get the money. And so I worked during the day and got time off to go to school. And at the school situation, I was given little problems to solve, and I did beautiful drawings and handed them in and failed, and had to repeat the next year. But in the office where I worked, I was given a file like this, and it said design a school, and it was given a file, and I had to go out and see headmasters and interview people, and did I ever have to swim? And I wholeheartedly agree, because in those 2 years I learned to design, but even though the university didn't think so, as far as I was concerned, I was only going to university to get a ticket. And if you only go to school to get a ticket, well then that's pretty bad. Right, look, I
just like to make last one point. It seems to me that from what everybody's saying to hear about the idea of architects right now, they're nothing more than engineers. In fact, that
they're definitely not engineers. They're definitely not engineers.
It seems to me why.
If you've spoken to engineers, boy,
yeah, I have.
I'm sure you have. They can't see beyond.
It depends.
That word right there.
Now let me explain.
I've spoken to thousands.
I've spoken to quite a few.
They don't
let me
know
explain.
what environment means.
No, let me explain. Okay, because it seems to me like if I look at engineers and stuff like that, if I look at the best engineers, like saying it said that about it says about 10, at the very most, about 5% of the engineers actually have control over what they're doing. 95% of the people are merely technicians who can do the same thing. It seems to me that architects, if you look at them, that is, if you look at firms, it seems to me that the top staff, all it does, okay, we'll see you. Top staff, all it has to do is once you make a position and a name for yourself as an architect, you make the conceptualizations, everybody else does a filler for you. That's what the other architects are. They are engineers, it seems to me. Now, I don't know if that's different, like, on the firms you're talking about, they're somewhat different. I could see in the conceptual states, seem to have other kinds of problems that are involved there. That is that I agree completely with you when you talk about the politics and everything else, and it seems to me that saying that what you're talking about as far as community is really, really good. But then the other problem which comes up is saying that when you throw a lot of these people into the community without any kind of understanding, the community could get hurt by that too. You see what I'm saying? Because let me explain what I mean by that. Since you have a limited amount of funds, right? And if you have poor people handling those funds and they eat those funds up, then they've hurt that community.
But you're not talking about something else. That is education to the community, so they to enable them to handle the funds. But I'm talking about kicking a student, and I'm assuming there's no funds involved, no money.
Okay, that's different.
The student goes in there and he has to create the funds.
Okay.
He has to find the ways to get those funds. That's his responsibility.
Okay, that's fair, then I can understand that.
There's no money involved. He not only has to train himself, he has to train the community along with him.
Right.
Because he isn't always going to be there.
Okay, that sounds more like, saying, okay, that makes it forces you to address yourself towards that community.
This
you
is
are
what
part
I'm
of that
saying
thing.
when I talk about community organizations. 1% of community organizations have money. I'm talking about the 99% that don't. They don't have any money.
Okay,
they have an inkling of wanting to do something, improve in their community. They have enthusiasm. They get together. That's it.
Okay, that I could do.
They can't go anywhere because their education is, unfortunately, at that level. The student supposedly is supposed to be able to think for himself. If he can, and you put him into a bind, he should be able to think his way out of that bind. Otherwise, he has not been educated.
Okay, 90% of the students that graduate from here can't think.
Exactly.
But I'm telling you, the reason why is that they haven't been put out on their wrath and told to, you're in a zero situation, make it something.
Okay, that I could take. That shows people.
You're going into a situation where it's slum, couldn't be more despondency if you wanted it. You have to solve that problem. Get these people good housing conditions, for instance.
Part of the solution.
Go. And see what happens. I can tell you a lot of people will fall by the wayside. But that's part of the system. You have to accept this. The existing educational system doesn't accept this. The existing educational system doesn't accept this. You can just carry on for ages and get credits. And you're bound to get through sometime. Just bound to. I mean, if you've got the money, you can't fail. Education today, you can be bought.
In fact, it is, though. In other terms, not like the way you're talking about is education is bought. It's bought in other terms too.
Well, I think
we don't have to go into.
One of the greatest things that was said to me was by a guy who's now actually teaching school architecture when he was at Systems Development Corporation. He said there are only 3 things in life that are mandatory. One is the penal system. I've forgotten what the second one was, but the third one was education. Is mandatory. And when you classify it like that, you suddenly realize something must be wrong. You can't get out of it, you have no option, it's compulsory. It's like segregation now in the South. It's compulsory, you don't have the option. Why the hell? Of course you bloody well should have the option. And what's the result? They put students on buses for half an hour. By the time he gets to school, he's so tired he doesn't even know what education is anymore.
Yeah. Well, see, a lot of saying that's the idea of saying shifting one problem to another area. So
you're just transferring problems. That's all. And giving money for the transfer.
See, that's where the middleman picks up again.
No, to a certain extent, it's like Operation Breakthrough. What is Operation Breakthrough? It's simply an American exercise on a European existence, which has been going for 20 years. Just look at any European country or Russian country. System building is all over the show. America now are coming into it 20 years behind. What's their goal? 600,000 new housing units a year. 200 million population. Do you know what England's housing goal is? Has been for the last 5 years. 600,000 housing units a year. Population is 50 million.
Sure, but then we say
it's a quarter as much. That's the difference in the system, you see. That's why, when I start talking about Europe, I think there's some hope as far as mankind is concerned. When you look at America, I seriously think,
well, John,
it's tragic.
I agree with that too, and the analysis seems to be, and I wonder about it saying it's almost like saying it's interesting that Europe finally came to that conclusion after it came into almost decline, though, as far as economics.
But you see, that is not
as far as economics.
Yeah, but that is not the solution.
I know it isn't a solution.
You see, the solution now, the European solution is now 20 years old, and what's happening is America's just adapting it. Instead of turning around and saying, well, forget Operation Breakthrough, let's have our environmental breakthrough. Let's spend exactly the same money on creating a totally new concept for environment, which they could quite easily do. You can't tell me they don't have the mechanics for it.
I don't think they have the men.
Technicalities for it.
I don't think they have the men or the mentality.
I do. But I think that the men, a few of the architects are so suppressed.
I agree.
And every time they come up with the idea, everyone just laughs.
Or so same with the youth too. Okay, it's not the architects. It's not a specific category like just architects and things like that. It's a hell of a lot of people, and they are suppressed.
Look at youth.
And they're brought up by a system.
Youth get out of school and they don't know what to do, so they go and steal or do whatever they break windows, riot, whatever they want. They don't have anything else to do, and the capacity isn't beyond that, unfortunately. You see, that means that the education system is wrong. Because when they leave school, they should be into something.
Okay, our school system is based upon the idea of saying professionalism too. It's based upon the idea of saying discipline, who didn't mean discipline study, it meant discipline as far as equating into a professional job that is useful for the society. And that educational system is very invariably tied in with the economics again, and the political system too. And so when we break that cycle, it seems to me it does happen. Okay, one, we could catch it on different ends, and I think a lot of us are trying to do that. It's not just architects and things like that.
No, I think you can quite easily look at the problem much easier than you did when you first came in with your grandiose statements. And it's quite simply this. If you start off here at 0 when the monkey came in, and you look at 1969, and two things, population and inventions. Inventions basically, result in...
Okay, anything.
They go like this. They're doubling. They basically double all the time. And in 1970, they are vertically going like that. And they are both the same. And two things, population and inventions. Nothing else is keeping up with them. And
knowledge.
Until we do, and no, knowledge isn't, unfortunately. Until we do.
Isn't knowledge doubling?
Knowledge is doubling. I wish it was. Engines are doubling, we don't know how to use them. Just look at computers. Just take a computer, for instance. I thought when I was at school, a computer was a fantastic tool. It was a time-saving tool. What happens? You need a person to feed material that he's already worked out, programmed or typed into the computer. Right? It comes out the other end as paper, Xerox paper. You now need at least one girl full-time to file that paper, another girl full-time to get that paper out and use it. So what have you done? You're really not saving anything. It's as simple as that. You don't realize that this computer has the capacity to store all that knowledge, and all you have to do is go to it when you want it. You don't have to turn out paper. But the computer's turning out paper every time you put a problem in. And people are orientating themselves to the paper and not to the machine. Because that's mankind's thinking, you see. Yeah. And he's not realizing the capacity of the computer.
How can he realize the capacity of the computer when he probably hasn't realized the capacity of man?
He should realize the capacity of the computer. He created it. I mean, they know what storage banks on computers are. But you see, they haven't orientated their thought now to computer thinking. Every time they want to do something, it's got to be done in black and white. So they have to go in the computer prints it out in black and white. But the human doesn't interact with the computer and then just leave the knowledge in there and then transfer that knowledge somewhere else. And the other problem. Well, I would. Whose budget, yours or mine? Alright, we get back together.
We got back to what we started with, which was creating curriculum.
Curriculum?
So we're supposed to come
So we wiped it all out.
We decided that this education system just couldn't work.
Exactly.
Well, the starting statement was raise university. I haven't progressed since then.
Yeah. A curriculum in the university. Since I don't have much expertise in that, I won't even speak to that.
Hell, you do. Oh, well, that's something else. Like you here if you haven't got a curriculum.
You know, the depressing thing is that what everyone's talked about right here this evening is exactly what we've been talking about for so long. It's complete repetition. And I have the feeling, you know, I've heard it all this before. I've said it all. And I keep thinking, well, where do we go from here? You know, we seem to know it. I wonder if some of the other heads in this seem to know it. And can act on it. Yeah, but can act on it.
It's not constant.
There are people in here with the power and the money to act on what we've been saying. We're the only ones. I'm interested.
No,
Really.
I think to a certain extent you're right. I know within the educational system there is. There's
yes.
definitely the people who have the power and the money to do something about
They're
it.
not the people who are creative or innovative or thinking in these terms.
Definitely not. But if you look at some of them, they were when they were younger.
Oh, yes, that's really depressing.
But they had to cut that out in order to make profit.
That's right. They had to conform to get along with the system. But now they have got along with the system and they're in a position to amend it. They don't.
They're too much of a part of it, brain.
I mean, they're making too much.
They're in the system.
And so as you develop, and you know, your orientation to the system changes, you become more adaptable.
And once you reach that,
once you start adapting,
you're damned.
John, what's going to happen to the 10 students who aren't in the system now, graduated from school, who aren't in the system? You talked about your graduating class.
Yeah.
There's 10 architectural students out of 11. One of them went into the system. Yeah, the other 10 are doing creative things. What's going to happen to them?
Very interesting. I think they get something.
Are they going to go back into the system, or are they going to keep creating? Are they going to keep being involved?
Well, the state has got now where 4 of them have gone back into the system, basically because they couldn't make it on their own. But one's gone back in as an economist, because he feels he has more control as an economist than he does as an architect. 2 are planners, because they feel they have more control as a planner than they do as an architect.
So the goal seems to be control rather than money.
Yeah. None of them are in, I don't think any of them, their primary interest is money. As a professional...
I think that's a change.
No, I think as a professional, no, not, yes and no. As a professional, they know that they can make enough money to keep them happy.
Yeah.
Right? So whether they make 12,000, 15,000 or 20,000, there's no difference to them. It is to a GBA student. But even some of the GBA finance students that are coming out of here haven't been accepting the top jobs. They've been accepting the more challenging jobs. And I think this is where the 10% of students there's hope in.
Among law school graduates, and that's why I was very interested.
Yeah, we know some graduates who are out into the community trying to do things instead of going into a law office. They're there for 2 reasons. A, they want to help the community and society. B, they want to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, there is that motivation in there. That
There's
is
a
it's
motivation.
a quicker way too. It's a quicker way.
And I think, but I think this is another interesting realm of students who are coming out of school. Some of them now are going to. They're interested more in making a name for themselves than they are in making money. The result of making a name means they're into more challenging things. And most of these challenging things mean challenging the system or looking at new ways for the old solutions and old problems.
So what's that?
There's only 10%.
It's 10%.
It's 10% of the of the students.
It's never
which
been
means
more
it's
than
probably
10% in any other
only
situation.
2% of society.
Okay, that's probably true. But what we're saying is okay, that the situation has always been existent in a lot of ways. That is that whenever major changes come about, it seems to me it's because of saying one. It's not because the upper 2% start creating so many changes. It seems to me it always comes about from discontent from the lower segment.
No,
when
I
they
think
finally can't put up with it.
No, I think another thing is that, unfortunately, research scientists have blinkers on. Very, very narrow conception.
They have to. That's what the research is about.
They don't have to. That is what the research is about, and that's the way they go, and because of the research, yes. Let me give an example. The car. The guy who invented the car, right, invented it, first of all, for pleasure. But the car then suddenly controlled society. He didn't conceive what the car could do to mankind. He created a toy machine, just as the wheel had been created before him. But the wheel was a labor-saving device, whereas the car wasn't. It was basically a pleasure device, ease of getting from A to B. But he didn't see the control it could have. His conception was limited. And I think this is exactly the same with society today. I'll be very interested to see what happens with the moon.
Yeah, like Teller wants to blow up an atom bomb there to see what kinds of reactions, and he could have tests on it. That is a test of veracity of the effect of the
It's like TWA. Was it TWA?
What's it do? That's his goddamn fixation right there.
It was like TWA. The president made a statement about 3 days ago that you could start booking for a trip to the moon. $6,000 return trip. First flight 1985. See? That's down the conception of today.
Yeah, sure.
It's like the airplane. The airplanes are beautiful. Example. Technicality, product, it's there. It's great. What happens when it hits the land?
Same thing with the nuclear power, sure.
Well, no, with nuclear power, they're using something. They're using the energy to the benefit of mankind, produces electricity, a series of other things. They've controlled it.
Except
they're using it for, diseases.
A lot of stockpile left.
There's still stockpile, yeah. That's a strange thing. On one hand, it can destroy. On the other hand, it's the biggest benefit.
Sure. That's the age we have. No middle ground. That's the age we're developing, is where there is no middle ground for any of us to stand on.
Well, I guess no. I think until very recently, minority people have been in the middle ground, although they haven't realized it.
And
now I just think if you look at them, that they tended to accept what we're never part of. And now they're not accepting anymore. And that's why you have the Black Panther. Now they are beginning to become at opposite ends, the whites and the blacks. You still get a lot of middle people who are accepting the system, like our friend W. There are a lot of people like that think they've made it because they're part of the system. They don't seem to realize they haven't. They've done nothing for themselves, they've done nothing for mankind, they've done nothing for their own race.
And nothing for themselves, when it comes down to it.
No, nothing for themselves because they're not in a position of control. It's like few of the black people who have made it is this firm in Cleveland that set up their own insurance, mortgage lending company for blacks. Now it's $1 million concern. There, we're getting somewhere now, we're talking. They've created their own system.
Do you think that the systems that they're going to be creating are going to be able to exist within the current system that that surrounds them? That is, can we create these small kinds of systems for ourselves, that is, mini environments within the maxi environment, which seems to be completely fucked?
No, I think you can.
Do you think we can? Do you have that hope?
And unfortunately, I think that's the way change is going to come about. I don't think change is going to come from the top.
Now, what about groups that are pushing for change, that maximum change quickly, that those groups will probably be crushed, such groups as the Panthers, other groups? They are being crushed, I realize that.
No, I don't think they will. I think they'll become stronger and stronger. And with those kind of groups, not necessarily the Black Panther, which is, militant, but that kind of extremism, I think will be successful.
Do you see that kind of extremism, so to speak, the kind of mentality which allows for extremism, that is, the drive, the motivation, everything else to go through with it, is that happening in all sectors, in fact, your sector?
It's definitely not happening in every sector. It's happening in so minute a sector, it's unbelievable. That's obvious.
That's where architecture has to direct its effort.
Let's get some coffee.
So what do you talk about when you talk about curriculum?
I was really interested in this.
Yeah, I'm interested.
I'm so sick of academic innovation.
What's going to happen now is
Like, we've been trying to innovate for so long, and it's almost ridiculous, because we're trying to innovate, a situation, an environment for people that can't even fit into it anyway, even if they wanted to. That is, let me explain that. That is, it seems to me the people that are able to take advantage of this in a lot of ways are such that they're already making those situations for themselves. That is, they might create buffers and things like that. They're hustling, really. That's what they're doing right now. But if we want to create that kind of situation in a lot of ways, it seems to me almost that we have to create either, maybe not possibly not quite as extreme as a counter institution, because I don't think that'll develop. But I think there has to be, like almost a mini institution, as we talked about, like saying. Extreme examples might be your own type of think tank, not just a think tank with something that has action orientation too based with it, like there are a lot of community groups now developing. It seems to me that there's a lot of other sectors we could look at for examples of that. There are radical education projects that are now developing, trying to disseminate information which doesn't get around. We are trying to create our own media. We are trying to create, in fact, our own kind of culture, too. And it's extremely difficult because, goddamn, everything we do is co-opted by the system. And as quickly as we could get it out, they take it in. And they make a profit on it. And so, like saying, okay, so what do we do with a system like this? And saying, how many people can you get out of this? How? What do you suggest as far as that goes? What game are you into, really?
Community
development.
And do you see yourself as how do you relate to like conversations with people here like you talk about you're not an architect or anything like that, or are you? See, how do you relate to experts that are trying to like that respond so quickly, or trying to respond, maybe not necessarily responsiveness as far as responsibility, but trying to respond, at least the impetus to respond. How do you relate to these kinds of individuals? Like they're coming from all sectors, really. They're architects, they're businessmen, everybody else.
Because it's just rhetoric. When I respond to any kind of technical expertise, supposedly, presupposed, what have you,
or disposed expertise.
Show it. Yeah. I'll give you the opportunity to walk the walk.
But how can you? Why do you keep saying almost in a lot of ways? A lot of us keep on feeling like this is this is kind of jive in a lot of ways. Then why do we keep coming to things like this in a lot of ways? That's the question to ask.
Can I find another job I love?
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's probably the reason.
I can't look maybe some expertise to help on our program. That's why I come. I put out front. I'm here as a buyer, man. If you're gonna talk, man. Let's walk the walk. Yeah.
He's a consumer at no cost.
Right. I won't pay you. Come do your thing. You want to bullshit, man? I'll give you the opportunity to make it happen. That's it.
But I think unfortunately a lot of students just aren't in that position where they can accept that kind of responsibility.
I don't know.
I think most.
I don't know. I don't think they've ever, even broached the subject of not even accepting the responsibility. It's like never given the opportunity to accept responsibility. Who's giving them the opportunity?
It's true. Well, that's the other question that's saying, okay, let's look at it this way. One of the major problems that seems to be existing now in the university that is that a lot of the activist-oriented people tend to come out of the social scientists realm, and those people don't have any goddamn skills other than their damn labor to offer in a lot of ways. Very realistically, they don't.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
See, whereas
all you've got to offer, is who you are.
Yeah, well, that's always been true, but I'm saying what you are in a lot of ways, like other people have skills, they have saying, okay, let's take Cuba in a lot of ways, it was the same example, that is, almost everybody wanted to go to Cuba to help out, but very few people of those people that went over there had the necessary kind of background which could relate to their situation. That was a major kind of problem they encountered there. It seems to me that the same kind of shock has gone on into whatever community you might define as community. Community is a nebulous term anyway. And I would really question that. I just really get pessimistic in a lot of ways when I see how many people are able to survive in a lot of ways, like in the sense that John seems to be surviving, or anybody else, or even the ability for community groups to survive themselves. That is, that community groups come and go. The same people, you find hardcore people that are involved in community, like Pinky and possibly yourself and other people such as yourself. But I mean, community groups come and go. I know people that represent 15 different groups in the last 5 years or whatever, and they know every other group that exists. But as far as any ability for that to continue, it's really questionable. It's getting almost more and more. How do we say it?
That's always dependent on who you are. Again, our group's been in existence for 5 years.
Which one's that?
Pico Union Neighborhood Council. We've moved from nothing to where we're at now. We're talking about housing.
But the whole point is that community groups are going nowhere. They basically don't know better. They don't have the ability to get themselves out of their routine. And I don't think at this point in time the architectural students who were thrown out there would really help them. I really don't. But I think unless you do, those students are going to be in exactly the same position when they leave school, which is where they're at.
I don't know, John. I
think some would make it and some would.
Yeah. It at least offers a potential resource. At least the damn students should at least have an inkling of where the hell to look. And if nothing else, that's helpful.
Well, the reason I made a suggestion is in the presentation was I think students could.
Yeah.
I think students could if given the chance. They haven't been given the chance to find out to prove themselves.
Right. Give them
but
the
I'm still
opportunity.
doubtful.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
One thing that was upsetting with this dude over here when he spoke, man, I was wondering, I could see, a student coming out of graduate student, but fresh out of high school, 2 years in the community, from wherever he's at, man, at whose expense? At the Panthers' expense? At the Braves' expense? At Margaret Wright's expense? Bullshit. A graduate student, at least, he knows where the hell to look, if nothing else. Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Like even
Must qualify that one.
Even the idea of research, one of the problems with research the students get here is that they're directed as far as the research. Even their capability of finding research might say that, in its fine terms, would say that it gives ability to, like saying, getting the whole mass of knowledge and then trying to figure out some kind of, just what the hell's where. And that kind of ability to just exist and survive is some kind of quality that most students don't have at all. They can't exist in the real world, that's why they become educators.
Actually,
Academicians.
I just thought of one real problem. If you do get students out into the community and make them swim, and they're successful, they'll then be walking into architectural offices with exactly the same knowledge and expertise as the owners of that architectural firm.
It's intellectual anarchy.
That sounds good. Let's do that.
It doesn't have it in the system.
No, but on the other hand, you don't have to wait in the firm 20 years to do it. You could do it in a year at school. You can't do it overnight. Definitely not. It's going to take at least 6 months, at least 2 quarters. It's going to take at least 2 quarters and practice full time. Things don't happen that quickly in the community. Simple as that. You really begin to learn city department power play is. You think of that city department down there, and you think one department, another department. But the biggest power play is between those departments. It's exactly the same on this campus. There's a power play between all the different departments as to who can get what grants, who can pull the money in, who can become prestige little departments, who can get a national name. And it's exactly the same in City Hall, corporations, wherever.
Feudal system here.
I like to think of Vernon Center.
Bro? You don't have too many
I think I'll have a cup of coffee.
answers to the case, bro.
So you could have the rejuvenation in there. I'm thinking Vernon Central because that just happens to be what I can visualize that as a mode of transportation.
I'm not sure exactly.
Inside
the economic study of all these
You're going to present something.
Yeah, I am. Otherwise, you're just going to get mundane.
What are you going to do to crowd this out?
I'm right there. When you study, do you study the importance of rapid transit?
No, we can't.
Why not?
Well, because you don't have to give that old stuff.
Well, this is our
They died in this better way than that. That was square cake. But you know ultimately the rapid transit.
Wayne, you're impossible.
I'm hungry. See, while everybody else is talking about their rhetoric, I'm eating.
You're making me hungry.
What problems, I was just talking to Bill Everson, and he's been working on the UCLA Compton project, and it's a real fiasco. I've always felt and looked forward to the day that it was like a dream, that the university really would become involved with the community. Looks like that they're attempting it, even now. Somehow, after spending a year out here with the undergraduates, I found out that they really needed something that the university wasn't giving them. And like this place got scares of money. You know, like we did a research out here, and we know that the money is available. But I just can't understand, why can't the university get involved?
That's the question I wanted to ask. Is the money really available?
Of course it is.
Because now...
The money to research or the money to build?
I'm getting a little mixed
Money
up
to
because I
research?
hear complaints that we're broke now. We have no money, that the governor's cut our water off, that we can't move the way we would like to move here. Now, who's right and who's wrong? Let's get down to the facts. If there's money available, must it be used for only specific purposes, or is it being diverted for other things?
Well, one of the examples
aren't so important. This is what I want to find out.
You got a vice chancellor here that knows all the ropes on getting money under the Title I and Title II of ESA. The Department of Education never uses all of their money. Every year they just get more money added.
Well, what you see the shortage of money in? Money to do what now? What do you see as the urgent need?
Oh, I think if they had the money, they could find a lot of things to do with it. That's the problem.
I would like to see, you know, like the idea that Larry's talked about and Gene Wilhite of taking the university to the community. Take the people out there. You know, like get them out of this environment.
You take the student out of the hall.
Right.
And put him out in the field.
Right.
Now, by doing that, you also kill two birds with one stone, because if there's from studies that have been done, the money between 80 to 87% of the money that is allocated to any project, whether it be the university project, whether it be the government projects, 80 to 87% of that money goes to bureaucratic costs, and the remainder of it is all that the people ever see. And that's one of the reasons that Nixon's welfare bill is such a farce. Now, you accomplish two things by decentralizing the university away from the campus. You would, number one, get around the bureaucracy, because rather than, say, funding a certain project and, say, turning it over to whoever here on campus is going to be controlling those funds and then having him allocating it to different places, by doing that, you're building up these bureaucratic costs. If you had a decentralized projects, say one in Compton and one in Venice, 25 to 30 miles apart, but at the same time each of those projects was individually funded and organized, you wouldn't have as much bureaucratic hassle.
Okay, Lee,
with the central government.
Now you've got to remember something. Let's begin at the beginning. I think you're talking about one thing, and I think Pinky's talking about something else altogether.
I was getting ready to talk about.
You got a university. It's a state-supported university. Okay. Now, you're not just going to be able to change around all the basic curricula and all the ways of teaching kids in undergraduate school. You're not going to really accomplish much by doing this.
Why?
Because you've got to. There's certain fundamentals which you've got to learn. I think what Pinky was getting at is broadening the student and the student's attitude, and maybe making a bit of a different student out of it, and taking him out of the school. When I went to this school almost 30 years ago, it was an entirely different situation than it is today. I stayed on the campus, and everything I learned, which might not have been a hell of a lot in those years, I learned here. I will say this, that whatever I studied here at UCLA 30 years ago, I learned well. This was a good school. Now, I don't know, I got what I considered an excellent education. I think we have problems right here on the campus that are very severe as far as the student is concerned. I think a lot of your students would like to get off campus if they could. But Pinky, what are they going to learn when they get off campus? How are they going to be taught?
Well, they learn a new lifestyle that they haven't been exposed to. This in itself brings about an awareness. You see, their minds are too set into the set pattern of the American type of education, which is outmoded and outdated for this world. Kids need to learn about other people. Like you don't need to go to Europe. Like see America first, like see your own backyard first, and understand it and learn it. There are people out there. That's all. I think that, eventually we can turn on enough of them to bring about some change.
I I agree, but I think this is attacking the problem the roundabout way. There's no question that bringing the kids out of their westward look is going to broaden their education. But I don't think it's going to do much good for quite some time to the problem that you raised first, to get good housing, to get good environment, to get the minimum standards that are needed to rise from the bottom. I think that if we fool ourselves that we're going to do that with the kids from school or with the research projects or with the meetings and the workshops, we are not going to do it. There is only one way, and all what we have to do is look at what other countries have done in housing for the poor. They've had a very simple, straightforward, direct answer. They have built housing and subsidized it in one form or another. We may choose to subsidize it by raising the bottom level of income, which is the cleanest way. We can subsidize it by rent subsidy on a massive way, so that there will be real input of housing. But to hope that simply because we see the light of all what is wrong and all what is bad and all what is dirty, things are going to get straightened up. It's too long. I don't think we can wait that long. I think we have to press for what is a more direct attack.
So just
money. Money not for the research project, not for sending the students there, money to build decent minimum housing, to build decent schools, to build all what is needed to raise the level at a minimum that remove the disadvantaged start. And I think we are kidding ourselves, and many of the kids are kidding themselves when they think that just by becoming emotionally involved, they are going to do a great deal of help.
Now, keeping in mind that we're supposed to be developing a curriculum for urban problem solving,
yep.
Would you say then that to start, that the thing to do would be to offer courses in one way or another that would make the student aware of the fact that the way welfare is set up, and that the way that the city housing projects is set up, that if somebody who is on welfare has their income go up, that the way things are set up now, their rent goes up right along with it. So a person is stuck in a dead end. They're stuck in a trick bag when they do.
I would say that the most
so make students offer students classes to students that will make them aware of the present problems involved in improving housing conditions.
Yeah, and I would say the most effective way that they can be of help is to become political animals. Pressure for changes at the legislative level, both at the state and the federal. In other words, if the student is aware, and instead of wasting the time in redressing the detail wrong, which emotionally may be more gratifying, that might give him a lot of ego satisfaction in going out and parade and so forth, and getting himself arrested, if instead he entered the game of the system as it is, because short of overthrowing the system, we have to work within it. We may choose to overthrow it, but I think that will have other disadvantages. I think that otherwise, the best thing to do is for the school to create courses that translate awareness into political action and teach the student how he can be politically effective. The doctors have always done that. When they felt that there were matters of sanitation that were going uncared for, they saw to it that we had laws that require certain minimum standards of sanitation, a certain minimum standard of controls on food and so on and so forth. The architects ought to have the same role in society. They ought to be the one to demand the minimum standard, not the do-gooders. It must be the architects, because they are the one who can know best. But I think that the most effective way is to put the pressure on government, on all level of government, the city council, the state, the governor, the federal government, so that the system itself works. I think that attempts to overthrow the system are going to set us back, because the system is much too strong. You see, we have reached a very critical situation in our society that we never have before, in which the poor are a minority. Historically, the poor have always been a majority, and there was a great deal of hope for democracy if you were a majority, because at least you could hope that you had enough vote to solve the system. But we have gone to the point where the poor are a minority. The silent majority is very real. There are those who were poor a generation ago and now are not only well off enough, they have become well off and conservative, much more than the rich. The real conservative today are the children of the laborers who were the heroes of the labor movement a generation ago. So the democratic system will not work normally because the poor are not enough. white, black, doesn't matter. They've just done enough to make the grade. So what we ought to do is have other instruments that put pressures on the government so that issues are brought to the attention and redressed. And that's what I think would be the most effective role that the school could play. Teach the architectural student to be political animals. You buy that?
Well, sure. You know, you're and actually, that's one of the basic reasons why the workshop came into being was to inform. Actually, it was to inform more than anything else. And what you're saying is that the greatest thing that you can teach him is how to deal with the forces of the world. With the forces, we call it politics, but it's more than that, right? Oh, just the pressures of the daily life, right?
That's right. And how to make the system react.
How we can overcome that.
That's right.
And sure, that's fantastic.
And I think you can have an effect. If you are dedicated, you can, as a minority, have effect. But you have to know what you want, and you have to know how to apply the pressure, how to be effective.
Excuse me, there's something, as ironic as it may sound, there's something at present going on at USC, which is called the Urban Semester.
Yes.
I don't know too much about that. Do you have...
I teach at USC, and I should know more about it, but I just started last week, so I'm not too familiar. But the Urban Workshop, the Urban Semester, as I understand it, is an effort to engage graduate students of many, many different backgrounds and fields into both contact and problem-solving exercises jointly, so that they can, as a group, see the different aspect of the problem concurrently. Oh yes, very much field-oriented, very much real situation-oriented. It has been, I think, very successful in getting the student excited by being exposed to each other, having students of sociology and students of architecture and students of well, engineering, there weren't many, but working together with different backgrounds on the same problem, attacking the problem from different angles.
Was there any, well, relating to what was said first, is there any, are the problems attacked from a political standpoint?
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I would say that the byproduct could be an awareness that could be politically effective, but I don't think that it is the orientation of the semester to become politically oriented. But I'm going to have my class primarily become, if I can, an exercise in seeing what is around, responding to what we have around, and translating the response into at least positions. At least if you have some position, you have a chance to express yourself politically.
Well, you know, I wonder, are we making taking full advantage of government programs which are in effect now? There are a number of government, for example, I just learned of one a few weeks ago, and I didn't even know it existed. Something about the government actually leasing from the owner-builder, say an apartment project, and I think they're limited in the number of units you can build at any one time. Was it 30 or 40 units, I think, at any one crack? And the government will lease them from the owner-builder and then, in effect, guarantee him that rent, principally, I guess, for poverty areas. Is this the idea of thinking? I mean, is this what they plan on doing?
It's an old program, Bill. You know about it.
But you have to know why.
I thought it was supposed to be a new program.
You have to know why.
Some builder was so proud that he was just getting involved in this thing. Now he was trying to tell me what a great deal this was, and did I have any people who might be investors who might want to buy these projects after he
just tell them,
gets them built.
Just go down, make your famous walk down FHA. Go ahead and hunt.
Yeah.
The same with the business. I got 150,000 applications waiting. You just ask Gordon, excuse me, what project can I walk through? Walk through? Wait a minute, we have an awful lot. We have a lot of projects. Yeah, Mr. Hunt, I know you have a lot of projects out here.
They're all on paper.
But
Just
Mr.
paper,
Hunt,
huh?
we're limited in our range that we travel, but what project do you have in the city?
Do you see?
Oh well, we have it out. We have them out in Sun Valley, and we have some started out in San Bernardino, and we have some in Pasadena.
You're right. They stick them all the way out in the woods somewhere.
Isn't that interesting? That
yeah,
is
well,
very interesting. And well, there is one you can look at, put up by Metropolitan, and it's very interesting. You just go down right there, Adams, just right back at the Catholic Church there, on Adams Boulevard and Vermont. No, Adams and Vermont. It's tucked in there, and there's 10 units in there.
10.
Yeah, and they're excellent because they put in physical form. We went out there and took 25 shots of that job one day, just because people wouldn't believe that we found the one job in all of the city of Los Angeles that's within the 458 miles that came within Gordon Hunt's description. But I mean, you know, it's interesting because you take the direct comparison between the space and the volume and the different and the space between the windows and the open court, and you compare that with any housing jobs that any of the public housing jobs that have been done within the last 20-25 years, you know, and they don't stack up big. After all, these units are 17 feet from window to window in the courtyard, and we measured the ones in South Village that were 60 feet apart. We said, isn't that interesting? One was done under public housing, the other was done under turnkey or leaseback housing. No, the reason that you have that type of program is because, you know, they cut off public housing and the right to build public housing 16 years ago on the referendum. So consequently, the housing authority went way down, and it lost all its stature. But what it lost was more than that. Now it can only manage, and it can't really determine and decide how much open space a person should have, you see. And so consequently, all that research that they could have been doing in 20 years on new types of public housing was all lost.
The trouble, to answer your...
Well, let me tell you something. This is unbelievable. I really don't consider myself a stupid man, and my children try to keep me alive, more or less. And then something's very wrong, and there's something wrong with your outfit, and maybe with yours, because the public is very badly educated. First of all, I knew nothing of this, nothing. Now, I'm sure if more people knew what has happened to, as you put it, our public housing program,
but
with all the bull.
Who's interested in public
housing?
Oh,
today they're... Bill, please.
But they aren't. We got 550 miles of freeways, and they can keep on going to Reseda at 70 miles an hour.
I think a lot of people in Los Angeles would be very much interested in knowing, in being made aware of
if they had to live in public housing, they'd be very interested.
I think what you were talking about before in relation to the difference in, for instance, the 16 feet between the units and or 17 feet and the 60 feet relates to designing what I had down here from when I was listening to, I can't remember which of you gentlemen I was listening to, is that it seems to be very important as to how the environment that the people live in, as far as the housing itself, the housing itself is constructed, that the relationship of that environment to the environment of the world around them, the whole city. Like, for instance, when a man, they say a man's home is his castle. Well, a man's home is not his castle if he walks back there and it's a shack. I mean, when you take a look at the way our cities are going with, you know, these fantastic skyscrapers and the hustle and bustle, we're getting closer and closer in L.A. here to New York every day. And do we want to build housing projects that are going to, you know, be a reflection of that clutter, or do we want to build a housing project so when somebody comes home they can more or less escape from that tedium?
You're talking absolute nonsense, if you don't mind my saying so. There has been approximately 2,500 units of high-rise apartment built in the Los Angeles area since the war, which is a drop in the bucket, and they're all high income. So they don't affect at all the hard feelings of those who live in the shacks. There is nothing, but nothing, that begin to approach the eastern city, let alone New York and here. High-rise housing, and I have nothing against it, but high-rise housing simply has no place here, and 2,500 units over 20 years, it's nothing.
Well, I wasn't even thinking in terms of high-rise. I was thinking in terms of, like, if you go down and see and I'm not talking about low-income housing. I'm talking about housing Brentwood and Westwood, and you take a look at the cracker boxes that they put up and charge $190, $200 a month for a one-bedroom. So I wouldn't pay that for. I wouldn't pay
All right,
that
now
for
let's
one if I was making
let's be
$50,000.
political animals. What can we do to prevent that from happening?
Zoning law.
No, answer that. What? No, you answer it.
Well, I don't think it's so much a political question as I do is think of one of an aesthetic consciousness of what people
All right,
want.
well, if people rent it, then we have either a long roundabout way, which is the one that Tim Rilland suggested. Let's get the new generation to be more sensitive to aesthetic values, so they will refuse to rent apartments that are built in that shacky way. That's a long way. We can build a lot of crummy city before we get to that point. The other, it's more direct and very difficult. And that's the one that we are attempting in a way, that is to have building ordinances that by some restrictions on minimum distances, percentage of floor area to lot area, size of windows and so forth, have minimum standards. Now, you must admit, you don't remember, but you should have seen the apartment buildings that were built here at the end of World War II. Some famous 608, I think, was called.
Yeah, 608.
That's right. Well, we've done a long way. Even the ugliest things that have been built today are so much better than what was built on 608 because the city did make an attempt to improve the building ordinance.
But to approach it from
unfortunately, there is no way to dictate taste by law.
Right. That's why I was saying that instead of trying to legislate it, that maybe if instead of you're never going to educate all the people and everybody in the community so that they won't rent these places. But if you educate the architects, that for instance, if an architect doesn't get his mind so structured and compartmentalized,
most of these buildings are not designed by architects anyway. They are designed by drafting services. The architects design about 3 or 4% of the individual houses built, and maybe 20% of the apartment houses.
Or the builder
built.
himself will want more units on a lot because he feels the land value is too high and he wants to make sure he gets more apartments on it.
The money aspect has a tremendous, money and politics has a tremendous effect. Now, it just happens that, you know, money when you can't see it is practically intangible. And politics, unless you see it in action, is intangible. But these are, because these are very, very interesting things. You know, how many times have I said to my students, I guess if I changed my mind 20 years ago, I must have been a politician. Maybe I could have built something by then, you know, rather than being an architect. I probably could build more being a politician. And maybe be a silly statement, but it could be true.
You'd probably get more built.
Yeah.
The paradox, the paradox is that the profit in the building business is not what you think it is. It's a risky business. Everybody who built high-rise apartment buildings in Los Angeles has gone broke, and they've changed hands a couple of times. They've all been a failure. Low-rise apartments have been financially more successful, especially for the greedy. But even so, it isn't that bonanza. It isn't the best way to invest your money if you intend to make a profit. And the reason is that the abundance of zoning for apartment buildings makes the competition work, and then the price level sort of adjusts itself. What will improve the quality of the environment more than anything else is the only way, as a matter of fact, by which we can improve the quality of the environment is a very revolutionary one, but we are getting closer to it, and that is remove urban land from private ownership. That's the only way that we'll get to it. In other words, land is private as long as it produces goods.
How do you relate that to educating an architect?
He'll get back. This is
I'll get to it. I'll get to it. If you agree with me, I have educated you. It's all done. Then what you do, you will become a pressure point. If this is the city, and it's built, and this is a farm, and there is growth that warrants this being developed. There are several forces that operate today. First of all, the tax assessor will say, oh, this farm is at the edge of town, so it's now valuable as buildable land and not as farm. So if its value as a farm was $1,000 an acre, it produced corn or whatever it is, now it's worth $4,000. Because this land here had been sold for $6,000. 2 years before. So the poor farmer is out of business. He can't continue to operate this land, so he has to sell. Who will sell to some builder, or rather to some middleman who hopes to hold it for a couple of years and see it go from 4,000 to 6,000. Now, if he keeps this land for 3 or 4 years, it has to go up, because otherwise it would have been better keeping his money in the bank. So now he sees how much he can put in it. And so there are subdivision laws that says the maximum they can put in it, and that's what they're going to have. In the meantime, the city will be asked to bring services to it, sewers and so forth. Now try another approach. This farm is ready for development. The city buys the farm. The city buys the farm at fair price plus some little premium. Nobody's hurt. The farmer got his money back. Incidentally, the farmer was never taxed any more than this as long as he waited, because he couldn't develop the land. Then the city said, okay, this land could be developed nicely. There is a freeway in here. We could have some medium density apartment here. We can have some industrial employment here, and we're going a lot of single family residents, and this will be a park, and it should be a park because it links with the system of park. We can make all kind of good or bad planning decisions.
Could you lease it back to the farmer for 99 years?
Huh?
Could you lease it back to the farmer for 99 years?
Well, it may well be that a certain sector will never be built, and this stays to the farmer for 99 years. In other words,
I wasn't being facetious. I think that's a...
There is that choice. In that case, you don't buy it. Now, the city, in effect...
But it does preserve it.
Yeah. You'll define what area you want to preserve. Today, you cannot preserve anything. Anybody who wants to develop, as long as it develops according to the subdivision laws, and as long as it puts up adequate bond and so forth, can develop. The only way that there is to keep land open is for the city to buy, and the city has no money to buy. Now, with this process, the city would then say, it owns the land now, and it decides this will be medium density, this will be low density, this will be high density, or whatever it is. Now, it will bring roads, sewers, and if need be, rapid transit. Now, this land has increased in value. Now, the city sells it back to any private enterprise at a higher price, different from here than from here and from here, because there are different uses, and private enterprise will have its role of building well, because it has to be competitive, but building within a framework that the community has chosen for its growth. Now,
so you bought it in the first place. The city bought it in the first place to protect the future growth.
That's right.
After the future growth took place, the way that it was designed as compatible with the other parts of the city, then you sell that. Then you sell that to
preferably, as a matter of fact, you lease it for a long period, even less, maybe 55.
Okay, can I just I ask these questions because they go fast. Oh, you lease it for 99 years, but you don't get any taxes on it. How do you get any revenue if you lease from the lease?
If you lease, the lease is in your tax. Oh, sure, you're better off because now you get not only back the lease on the basis of the original price that you paid for the land, but you get it on the basis of the price plus the cost of the improvement that you brought to it.
Oh, I see.
So you get it back in perpetuity. You are really the landlord.
Where does the city get the money to buy that?
Well, all we have to do is have a rotation. It's a little bit complicated. And the difficulty is not the money. The difficulty is the breaking down of a tradition of land ownership that comes from our rural past, and that will be very hard to break. But this is being done within democratic countries.
Okay, now
and it's not impossible.
The thing that I say is fine. It's an excellent example.
By the way,
I really appreciate it. But then, okay, let's take it out of the rural situation, bring it past the suburban situation, and bring it in the heart of the city. How do you do that in the heart of the city?
Well, in the heart of the city is much more tricky, because so far we have done it in a very insensitive way. So far we have said, okay, this is the heart of the city, and this area is fairly good, this area is rather poor, this area is really in bad shape. And it's in bad shape, and there isn't much we can do to help it straighten itself up. So we say, okay, we make it an urban renewal project, trade bulldozer, clear it. Now we try to find the highest and best use, which usually is to increase the density, because the urban renewal agency is motivated by profit as much as private enterprise, and resells it, which means that all those who lived here have been pushed aside, and now you haven't solved the problem at all. Now that's the old way of urban renewal. in some cases, we are beginning to see better ways. We're beginning to see urban renewal take an entire area. And then you study the entire area and you see where the money is best put in rehabilitation and assistance, where it's hopeless and you may want slowly to have change, but usually not by big increments. And possibly we're going to see some good examples of urban renewal.
Can the city preserve a space somewhere in there somehow by buying it?
My idea is that that urban renewal land should never be sold back. It should always be leased back. In other words, that the land.
Yeah, but it's always sold back.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
Is this a tradition?
It's not even in the law. The law allows you to lease it. I don't quite know why they sell it.
You mean you could contest it?
No, the city could, instead of selling you land in Bunker Hill, lease you land in Bunker Hill.
Yeah, but nobody has contested it.
No. That's a pretty thick book. It takes a lot of people.
In a very few instances it has been done, and it's perfectly legal. And the developer, by the way, would prefer it. He doesn't have to put out the cash.
Oh, sure.
And the city, it doesn't make any difference to the city, because if the city leases it, it then can borrow money with bonds on the strength of the lease that it has.
You know, all this property out here in the Marina Del Rey is all leased.
Sure, that's all
the county went ahead and developed it with the federal government.
Whatever,
made a very successful project.
Whatever we build today is going to be demolished in 40 years. So, or less. But I'm taking a long view. If we sell the land, 40 years from now, we have to do urban renewal again. Right. Instead, at least in 40 years, it'll all come back at the same time. Then we will choose. We'll say, well, okay, the use is still justified.
Why does the community redevelopment agency sell it?
I don't know.
Do they have? Is that what they're doing? They are selling the land?
Well, let me ask you this.
I don't think the builder really wants to buy it. I think he'd much
rather
lease it.
If he had a long lease,
why do they make him buy it?
I don't know. I never understood this.
They got to pay off the front man.
No. I don't think so.
Well, let me ask you this: downtown Los Angeles, we're going through the whole thing down there. Now, how can they? We're going through the whole thing and the plan and everything else. And you know that's got to be the densest.
You mean that Bunker Hill
area? Well, beyond that, in the corner and around Atlantic Richfield, the last thing is the park. That's the last vestige of a light in the shining ray. Now, obviously, let's go back to a conversation we had before. How can the city protect for the citizens some open space down there if they go through the same idea of selling back the land?
Well, they could sell the back land with a restriction on use of some of it. In other words, they could say this must be an open space and put it in the deed.
But if the plan is so much not controlled totally, but a great deal of it is controlled by the interests who put up the half of the planning money.
Oh, are you speaking of the downtown plan now?
Downtown.
Well, the downtown plan. I don't know who's going to be doing the downtown plan. I have no idea. The way it looks now, it'll be very much in the hands of the downtown owners group, and I think they'll pick planner that they'll be sure they can control. I suspect that'll be the case. The city has sort of relinquished its birthright on the planning process, or at least...
Great tragedy.
Yeah, very bad.
Ed Bacon in Philadelphia would never do it.
On the other hand, let's not cry before time. Maybe they will retain a planner who's competent, who will give reasonable advice.
But again, you have to come up to that politics and money thing, don't you? You really have to look that in the eye, because that intangible is going to work its way through.
I don't believe they are incompatible. I think that, you see, there are certain limit of development in the central area, but they are probably rather high. In other words, you should have a high-intensity corridor. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's good.
But
you can do it right, you can do it wrong. That's right. Well, the trouble is that we have frittered away our open spaces so stupidly. After all, the Civic Center Mall is an open space. It's pretty large. Only it's built in such a way that it has no value. I mean, we should have...
Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
The Civic Center Mall is the deadest space. It's got big fun. No, the first thing you should
get
have
a
put
heart
in the Civic
attack
Center
walking
Mall.
from the bottom to the top.
The first thing that they should do in the Civic Mall is get rid of some of the palms and some of the fountain and put a nursery school, so that the mothers who come to work at City Hall could take their kids to nursery school right there safely. They get out of the building, they pick them up at night and take them home.
Now, could that be related to, now that seems to be
Could
something
we
that
do
would
a
be
nursery
directly
school
related.
in pink, Georgia pink granite? You know, it's really true.
No, I don't think
the whole
you
thing
have.
just flows with
No, no.
the Georgia pink granite.
The whole thing is dead. It's a dead monument. So, you see, that